Hello, friends, and welcome back to The Snoozy Scientist, where we gently explore the mysteries of our world, one sleepy yawn at a time. Wherever you are on this planet, this peaceful space has been made just for you, a gentle corner where science and wonder can come together to carry you gently towards sleep. Tonight, we're drifting back millions of years to a time when Earth was alive with giants, the Jurassic Period. It was an age that began more than 200 million years ago and lasted for over 55 million years, a span so long that all of human history would barely register as a flicker within it. Scientists call this the Golden Age of Dinosaurs, and for good reason. The Earth then was hotter, wetter, and greener than we can imagine. At the poles, there was no ice, only forests stretching almost to the ends of the world, bathed in a climate that turned the planet into a vast greenhouse of life. But this age was no paradise. The air was thick and heavy with storms. There was no grass on the soil, no flowers to brighten the forest, only conifers, cycads, and towering ferns. And in that strange world, life reached impossible scales. Sauropods, with necks longer than buses and bodies heavier than a dozen elephants, towered over everything. Their footsteps could shake the ground like earthquakes. Their shadows could sweep across entire herds. To stand beside one would have been to feel small, like a toy dropped at the feet of a moving mountain. And yet, the land was not theirs alone. Look skyward, and you would see the rule of another dynasty. The pterosaurs, with wings sometimes as wide as a small plane, their bodies carried aloft on the thermals of warm Jurassic air. They were not birds, not in the way we know them, yet they owned the skies in a way no creature has since. Vast flocks may have darkened coastlines, their long jaws slicing through the air as they hunted fish from shallow seas that covered much of the continents. And those seas hid monsters of their own. Sleek, powerful marine reptiles like pliosaurs and ichthyosaurs turned the oceans into hunting grounds more dangerous than any shark-filled waters today. They were fast and ruthless, rising from the depths with jaws designed to end life in an instant. And even as life thrived, the Earth itself was changing. The supercontinent Pangaea was splitting apart, birthing new oceans, isolating species, and reshaping life forever. It was a time of awe and of danger, a world both alien and strangely familiar. Tonight, we'll drift slowly into that forgotten world. But before we begin, if you enjoy videos like this, slow, soothing, and quietly filled with wonder, I'd love it if you gave this one a gentle like and maybe tapped subscribe. It helps more curious minds like you discover this peaceful little corner of the internet, and it lets the algorithm know that sleep and science truly belong together. And if you'd be so kind, let me know in the comments where are you winding down from tonight, and what time is it there. It's always such a joy to see how far across the world these sleepy science videos reach. Now take a deep breath, close your eyes, let your shoulders soften, and together let's step softly into the Jurassic world. When we step softly into the Jurassic forests, it does not take long before the true rulers of the land appear, rising above the canopy, necks swaying like living cranes, are the sauropods. Among them were creatures we know today as Brachiosaurus, Diplodocus, and Apatosaurus. These were not just large animals, they were living mountains. A single one could stretch to more than 30 meters in length, longer than 3 buses parked end to end, and they could weigh as much as 50 tons. To see them moving through the forest would be to watch the land itself ripple and bend to their passing. Brachiosaurus carried itself with a posture different from most of its kin. Its front legs were longer than its back legs, lifting its shoulders higher so that its neck swept upward toward the treetops. With this design, it could reach leaves no other creature could touch, stripping whole branches from conifer crowns that towered above the rest of the forest. Imagine standing at the base of a tree, hearing the creak of wood as an enormous neck leaned in, and then the slow rumble of chewing as the animal fed calmly above you. Diplodocus, on the other hand, was built long and low, with a tail that stretched behind it like a giant whip. Some scientists believe that this tail could be snapped at incredible speeds, perhaps even creating a sound like a thunderclap. Herds of Diplodocus could graze across floodplains, sweeping their heads from side to side like enormous scythes, clearing ferns and low plants in wide arcs. Their presence would have transformed the landscape, opening paths through the vegetation and turning dense ground cover into open feeding grounds. Apatosaurus carried massive bones, heavier and denser than almost any other creature of its kind. Its neck was thick and muscular, perhaps built for pushing or shoving during displays of dominance. Fossil trackways suggest that Apatosaurus did not live alone. These animals, like many sauropods, moved together in herds. Imagine hundreds of tons of flesh and bone marching in rhythm, feet pressing into soft mud and leaving prints that would harden into stone. To walk among them would be to feel the ground tremble in a steady rolling beat, as if the earth itself had a heartbeat. The question of how creatures of such immense size managed to grow and survive has fascinated scientists for centuries. Part of the answer lies in their necks. With necks stretching longer than 15 meters, sauropods could feed over a vast area without moving their massive bodies. Some grazed low to the ground, others reached for the treetops, and together entire herds could strip forests efficiently without competing with one another for the same food. Their digestive systems may have worked like giant fermentation vats filled with microbes that broke down tough plants. Every mouthful of pine needles or cycads took days to process, yet their bodies were so efficient that the slow burn of digestion fueled growth on a scale unmatched in history. To reach such sizes, sauropods grew quickly. Fossil evidence from their bones shows that they could gain tens of kilograms every day, rocketing from fragile hatchlings to towering giants within only a few decades. Their hollow bones, surprisingly light for their size, helped them manage weight without collapsing under their own bulk. Their lungs may have resembled those of birds, with air sacs flowing through their bodies, delivering oxygen more efficiently than mammalian lungs could. In a world where oxygen levels were lower than today, this adaptation gave them the breath they needed to fuel hearts that pumped blood to brains perched stories above the ground. These immense bodies shaped their behavior. Herd life offered protection, especially for the vulnerable young. Fossilized trackways show small footprints moving in the center of herds, surrounded by the huge prints of adults, as if the little ones were shielded by walls of flesh. When predators like Allosaurus stalked the edges, the herd's very mass became its defense. No hunter could hope to bring down a full-grown adult without risk of injury or death. Instead, predators circled, waiting for a misstep, a calf that wandered too far, or a sick individual falling behind. Migration was a part of sauropod life as well. Large bodies demanded vast amounts of food, and once a region was stripped bare, herds would move on. Across floodplains, through forests, along river valleys, they traveled in long columns, their heads bobbing above the trees like ships on a slow ocean. These journeys may have stretched for hundreds of kilometers, carving highways into the land. Where they passed, vegetation patterns shifted, soils churned underfoot, and ecosystems reshaped themselves around their comings and goings. The presence of sauropods transformed the world in subtle ways, and their feeding opened gaps in forests that allowed sunlight to reach the ground, encouraging new plants to grow. Their dung dropped in mountains fertilized soils and fed insects and smaller creatures. Their very footsteps created pools that collected rainwater, leaving behind habitats for amphibians and fish. To call them architects of the Jurassic would not be an exaggeration, for they changed the land simply by existing. And so, when we imagine walking among these giants, it is not just their size that should leave us in awe, but the way they carried the ecosystem upon their shoulders. Every step was part of a cycle that nourished life around them. Every herd migration rewrote the landscape. These were not merely dinosaurs, they were walking mountains, living engines of the Jurassic world. As the ground still trembles with their imagined march, it draws us onward into the next part of this strange world, where their shadows mingled with others, and hunters learned to challenge the titans. As the herds of sauropods moved slowly across the land, shaping forests and valleys with every step, another kind of life was watching from the shadows. For every mountain of muscle and bone that walked the Jurassic world, there were predators built to test their strength and probe their weaknesses. These hunters were not small or timid. They were the sharpened edges of evolution, and when they emerged, the calm rhythm of the forest gave way to chaos. Among the most fearsome of these hunters was Allosaurus. This predator stood nearly as tall as a two-story house, with jaws filled with serrated teeth, each one curved backward to grip flesh more tightly as the animal bit down. Fossils reveal that Allosaurus may have reached lengths of up to 12 meters. Its body balanced on powerful legs while its long tail acted as a counterweight. Its arms, though smaller than its legs, were far from useless. Each hand carried three sharp claws, capable of raking prey or holding on to struggling victims as the jaws delivered the killing bite. Ceratosaurus carried a different look altogether. Along the top of its snout rose a distinctive horn, giving it a profile unlike any other hunter of its time. Its teeth were long and blade-like, more curved than those of Allosaurus, suggesting it may have been a specialist at tearing into softer prey or scavenging carcasses. Ceratosaurus was often found in wetter habitats, close to rivers and lakes, where fish and smaller dinosaurs provided opportunities. Yet it was no harmless fisherman. Evidence shows that it too clashed with larger prey, darting in with sudden speed, striking hard, and then retreating before the danger of retaliation grew too great. Even larger predators, grouped under the family of megalosaurs, prowled the land as well. These were among the earliest giant theropods, some stretching longer than a bus, with skulls packed with conical cutting teeth. Their remains suggest a global spread, roaming across continents as Pangaea broke apart. In some regions, they were the apex hunters before Allosaurus rose to dominance. Their sheer size and strength meant that even a single strike could change the balance of life and death in an instant. Hunting strategies of these predators remain a subject of deep fascination. Fossil evidence suggests that Allosaurus may have hunted in groups, though not necessarily with the careful coordination we see in modern wolves or lions. Instead, it may have been a looser gathering of individuals, drawn together by the scent of prey, striking at the same target in a flurry of chaos. Imagine a herd of sauropods grazing peacefully, and then from the tree line emerges not one, but several allosaurs. Panic erupts, trees crash, the ground quakes, and dust rises as 30 tons of prey scramble for escape. In the confusion, the predators lunge at the edges, isolating a juvenile or a weak adult, their jaws tearing and claws slashing as they converge. Ceratosaurus may have relied less on groups and more on ambush. Its body was more lightly built, its jaws equipped for sudden strikes rather than prolonged battles. Perhaps it waded along riverbanks or stalked through dense vegetation, lunging at unwary prey that strayed too close. Its horn may have served as a display, signaling strength to rivals or intimidating smaller predators that dared approach a carcass. The evidence of these clashes survives in stone. Fossilized bones of sauropods have been found with deep gouges, tooth marks left behind by predators. Some bones show signs of healing, proof that not every attack succeeded. These scars tell us that prey and predator lived in constant tension, locked in a struggle where survival was never guaranteed. Imagine the story written in a single vertebra, once torn open by teeth, then slowly knitting back together as the giant survived its ordeal. Each mark is a whisper of violence preserved across millions of years. Allosaurus itself was not free from injury either. Skulls have been found with fractures, bones with signs of infection, evidence that hunting giants came with a cost. To take down prey so large meant risking broken bones or fatal wounds, yet the reward of such a kill was immense, feeding not just a single predator, but perhaps many others drawn by the scent of blood. In those moments when predators struck and prey fled, the forest itself seemed to transform. The calm sounds of buzzing insects and rustling leaves gave way to the thunder of feet, the crashing of trees, and the piercing cries of both hunter and hunted. Dust rose in choking clouds, leaves shook loose from branches, and streams ran red as life and death played out an unstoppable rhythm. For a brief time, the serenity of the Jurassic world was shattered, replaced by chaos that echoed through valleys and across plains. And as the dust settled, whether the hunters triumphed or failed, the world carried on. Herds regrouped, predators licked their wounds, the endless cycle of survival continued, driving evolution forward. The echoes of these clashes still linger in the fossil record, guiding us onward to the skies above, where a different kind of master waited with wings stretched wide. While the forest shook with the steps of giants, and the plains echoed with the roars of hunters, above it all stretched another kingdom, one not of bone pressing into earth, but of wings cutting through air. To look up in the Jurassic skies was to see shadows that stretched across entire herds. Pterosaurs, the first true masters of flight, ruled the heavens long before birds became common. Some carried wingspans wider than small planes, vast sheets of leathery membrane held aloft by hollow bones and immense muscles that powered each stroke. Their silhouettes drifted silently over the land, blotting the sun and casting sudden darkness on the ground below. The design of their wings was unlike anything we see in the skies today. Where a bird's wing is formed of feathers stretched along an arm, a pterosaur's wing was a sheet of skin and muscle stretched along a single elongated finger, sometimes longer than a grown man. This gave them a vast surface area to capture air currents, gliding effortlessly over miles of coastline or swooping across forests with little more than a tilt of the wrist. Some were small, no bigger than a crow, while others, like the giant pterosaurs of later ages, spread their wings to lengths of 10 meters or more, rivaling the size of small aircraft. To watch them in flight would be to see the very sky itself alive and moving. Their lives were tied to the seas and lakes that cut into the land. Many were fishers, circling high before folding their wings into sudden dives, their jaws slicing the surface with speed and precision. Long beaks filled with sharp teeth were perfect tools for snapping up slippery prey. In shallow waters, some may have skimmed the surface with their lower jaws, scooping fish as they flew, leaving ripples in their wake like the strokes of a giant brush across water. Others likely scavenged along the shorelines, picking at the remains of carcasses left by marine reptiles or washed in by storms. Their role in the ecosystem was varied, both hunter and scavenger, both predator and cleaner of the coasts. The cliffs and rocky headlands of the Jurassic world would have been alive with their colonies, hundreds, perhaps thousands, nesting together on sheer walls that dropped into pounding surf. Their calls must have filled the air, a chorus of shrieks, croaks, and bellows, echoing over the waves. Fossil evidence shows that many species laid eggs in sandy soils or tucked them into cracks of rock, relying on the heat of the sun or the shelter of cliffs to nurture the fragile shells. Hatchlings, no larger than a hand, would have scurried across rock faces, spreading tiny wings in awkward first flights while adults soared in great spirals above. The sight of a colony lifting into the air at once would have darkened the horizon like a storm cloud in motion. On land, herds of sauropods and smaller dinosaurs moved through forests and plains, while above them the sky was patterned with wings. Imagine grazing animals suddenly pausing as a shadow passed, heads tilting upward as silence fell, broken only by the hiss of air over vast membranes. Though most pterosaurs fed on fish and small prey, their presence alone must have altered the mood of the world below. To live in the Jurassic was to share the land, not just with giants of flesh and bone, but with giants of air. Their dominance as complete in the skies as that of predators on the ground. The diversity among them was extraordinary. Some had long, slender wings built for endless soaring over seas, riding thermals for hours without a single flap. Others had shorter, broader wings, better for darting flights over rivers and forests. Many carried bizarre crests on their heads, tall and colorful displays that may have been used to attract mates or to signal dominance. These crests varied wildly, from small ridges to extravagant sails rising high above the skull, giving each species a profile as unique as any bird of paradise today. To see them up close would have been to notice the details that fossils only hint at: the leathery texture of wings glistening with moisture, veins glowing faintly in the sunlight as thin membranes stretched taut, the rustle of skin as wings folded against narrow bodies, the glimmer of sharp eyes trained to spot movement far below. They were not awkward or clumsy, as once thought, but elegant rulers of the skies, their lives bound to the currents of wind and the abundance of prey below. The world beneath their wings was one of constant change, herds migrating, predators hunting, oceans shifting with tides, but above it all pterosaurs sailed in an endless ballet. The sky itself belonged to them, a canvas they painted with sweeping arcs and spirals, with sudden dives and effortless glides. To walk through the Jurassic and not look up would be to miss half of its majesty, for the heavens were as alive as the ground. And so the story carries us upward, away from the shadowed forests and into the expanse of the open skies, where wings stretched across the horizon and colonies clung to cliffs above roaring seas. From here, the journey drifts naturally downward again, toward the waters themselves, where shadows deeper and darker than any wing moved beneath the surface, waiting with open jaws. Beneath the skies alive with leathery wings and the forests trembling under the weight of giants, stretched another world, one even more dangerous, hidden from the surface by the shimmer of water. The oceans of the Jurassic covered vast portions of the continents, warm and shallow along the coasts, but plunging into depths that hid creatures unlike anything alive today. To step from the shore into those waters was to cross a boundary into a realm ruled by predators as powerful and terrifying as any to ever exist. The most formidable among them were the pliosaurs. These were colossal marine reptiles, their bodies built like living torpedoes, with short necks, massive heads, and jaws studded with teeth the length of knives. Some grew to lengths of 15 meters or more, their skulls alone as long as a man is tall. Pliosaurs were the apex hunters of their world, able to crush bones with a single bite. Imagine swimming in those seas, the sunlight shimmering above you, only for a shadow to slide across your vision. Then jaws opened wide, and the last thing you would see would be a cavern lined with blades. Alongside them were their close relatives, the pliosaurs. Unlike pliosaurs, these creatures carried incredibly long necks, sometimes stretching to lengths greater than half their body. Their heads were small, almost delicate in comparison, yet filled with sharp teeth, perfect for snatching fish or squid from the water. A pliosaur could glide silently, neck weaving through the sea like a serpent, striking with precision at unsuspecting prey. Some scientists believe that their long necks allowed them to slip into schools of fish unnoticed, the small head darting in before the rest of the body was detected. To see them move would have been to witness grace and menace combined, ribbons of life curling through the water in eerie silence. Ichthyosaurs painted yet another shape into this gallery of predators. At first glance, they looked startlingly like dolphins or even modern tuna, but they were reptiles, not mammals or fish. Streamlined and efficient, they had evolved bodies shaped perfectly for speed, with long pointed snouts and huge eyes adapted to hunt in dim waters. Some ichthyosaurs may have dived hundreds of meters in pursuit of prey, their bodies capable of withstanding crushing pressure. Their eyes, the largest of any animal ever known, let them detect the faintest flicker of movement in the deep. Imagine a vast black ocean, silent and suffocating, then picture an eye the size of a dinner plate staring through the gloom, locking onto a flash of silver and launching forward in a burst of power too quick for escape. Together, these creatures turned the Jurassic seas into a theater of constant pursuit and ambush. Schools of fish, ammonites drifting in coiled shells, and even smaller marine reptiles all played their roles in an endless cycle of life and death. The predators had adaptations that seem almost otherworldly. Some scientists suspect that ichthyosaurs may have used hunting strategies similar to echolocation, sensing vibrations in the water, though not in the same way whales do today. Pliosaurs may have used bursts of speed, launching themselves like missiles toward prey, while plesiosaurs relied on stealth and the reach of their necks. Each body was a unique solution to the same challenge: survival in a world where to fall behind for even a moment meant death. The danger of the sea was not only in the jaws of these monsters, but in the way the environment itself magnified their power. Shallow coastal waters were perfect ambush zones, where shadows could hide beneath rippling waves until a sudden strike erupted. Open seas offered no refuge. For predators, there could outrun almost anything. Even the deep was not safe, for ichthyosaurs could plunge into darkness and rise again with prey clamped firmly in their jaws. The ocean was not a place of calm escape, but a stage where every movement might end in violence. To imagine entering those waters is to feel an immediate weight of fear. Sunlight might glitter at the surface, waves might lap gently at the shore, but just beyond the line where your toes leave sand for water, entire kingdoms stirred unseen. A ripple might be nothing, or it might be the wake of a predator longer than a bus. A school of fish scattering might be a random moment, or it might be the first sign of something larger rushing upward from below. The sea itself seemed alive, restless, filled with unseen eyes and waiting mouths, and in that alien world of constant motion, the balance of life played out with quiet efficiency. The monsters of the deep were not mindless killers, but parts of an ecosystem that relied on their hunger to shape it. Their movements sculpted the lives of smaller creatures, just as herds of sauropods reshaped forests on land. The oceans of the Jurassic were not empty, open waters, but dense with danger, alive with shadows, and darker and deadlier than any sea we know today. From the terror of the deep, the story rises again toward the surface, where storms gathered, and the climate itself set the stage for all life above and below. The oceans that teemed with predators, and the skies that darkened with wings, were shaped by a planet that felt very different from the one we know today. During the Jurassic, Earth itself lived under a kind of fever. The climate was hot, humid, and restless, a true greenhouse world with no ice caps at either pole. Seas spread inland across continents, swallowing low-lying lands until coastlines were scattered and irregular, dotted with warm, shallow bays where marine life flourished. The air wrapped itself around the planet like a thick blanket. Temperatures were higher on average than what we know now, not just at the equator, but stretching far into the northern and southern reaches. Even places that today lie under snow and glaciers were covered in forests of conifers and ferns. The difference between the poles and the tropics was less extreme, creating a planet more evenly warm, though not at all evenly calm. High heat meant high evaporation, and with it came constant storms. The Jurassic skies must have been heavy with rolling clouds, the horizon often darkened by sheets of rain. Monsoons swept across continents, fed by the vast seas that had crept over their edges. Lightning split the skies more often than in our present world, striking trees and igniting wildfires that cleared swaths of forest only for them to regrow in the damp heat. Imagine standing in a Jurassic valley, the air clinging to your skin as sudden thunder shakes the air and rain falls in curtains so thick it blurs the line between land and sky. These conditions shaped the creatures that lived within them. The warmth and abundance of plant life provided fuel for enormous bodies. Sauropods could gorge on vast quantities of vegetation, their herds migrating from one lush plain to the next, always finding growth renewed by sunlight and rain. The very size of these animals may have been tied to this climate. In a world where plants grew in near endless supply and seasons were less harsh, giants could thrive. The steady warmth meant that their bodies did not need to burn energy to keep warm as mammals do today, allowing them to invest in size, strength, and longevity. But gigantism was not only about food. The thick air, heavy with moisture, may have influenced how these creatures breathed and moved. Some scientists believe the climate encouraged the evolution of highly efficient respiratory systems, much like those of birds today, which allowed oxygen to flow through air sacs and hollow bones. In a greenhouse world with shifting storms and unstable oxygen levels, efficiency was survival. Every lungful mattered, every adaptation gave advantage, and over millions of years life sculpted bodies that could grow taller than houses and longer than city buses. Volcanic activity added even more drama to this climate. As Pangaea continued to split, rifts opened, magma surged, and entire regions were remade by fire. Ash and gases belched into the atmosphere, spreading across skies already crowded with clouds. These eruptions may have driven cycles of warming and cooling, sudden jolts to an already unstable world. Imagine a horizon glowing red with distant fire, the sky smeared with volcanic haze, and forests drinking in mineral-rich ash that nourished their regrowth. The earth seemed to breathe in steam and exhale in fire, restless in its deep interior. The high sea levels brought other consequences. Shallow inland seas acted as heat reservoirs, storing warmth and moisture that fueled storms and stabilized temperatures. These seas created habitats that supported diverse marine life, from coral-like reefs to vast beds of ammonites. Along their edges, coastlines were rich with opportunity for both predators and prey, offering fish for pterosaurs to skim and fertile shallows for marine reptiles to patrol. On land, the rising seas isolated regions, creating pockets where evolution could take strange turns, shaping unique forms of dinosaurs and plants that might never have appeared in a more connected world. The Jurassic climate was not gentle. It tested life with relentless rain, sudden lightning, choking heat, and the choking fumes of volcanoes. Yet within these extremes, life found ways not only to endure, but to flourish. Plants grew thick and tall, herds multiplied, predators sharpened their skills, and ecosystems expanded into every corner left open by water or fire. Earth itself felt alive, as though the planet was a great living organism, restless and steaming, pushing its inhabitants to adapt or vanish. And so the stage was set. A greenhouse world rich with storms, filled with heat and water, where giants found their strength, and the very shape of life bent itself to meet the moods of the planet. From these steaming valleys and storm-laden skies, the story drifts into the forests themselves, where the greenery held its own secrets, growing without flowers, without blossoms, in a form of beauty very different from what we know today. Step into the forests of the Jurassic, and the first thing that strikes you is not what is there, but what is missing. There are no blossoms, no petals unfolding under the sunlight, no bursts of color drifting in meadows. Grass, which today carpets much of the earth, has not yet evolved. Flowers, too, have not yet appeared. Instead, the world was cloaked in endless shades of green, a kingdom of plants that seemed both lush and strangely alien. Conifers rose like spires, their trunks stretching upward for dozens of meters, branches heavy with needles instead of leaves. They towered in silence, forming green cathedrals that filled the horizon, each tree older than many human lifetimes, their roots anchored deep in rich soil. Among them stood cycads, plants that looked like a cross between palms and ferns, their thick trunks topped with crowns of stiff leaves that spread outward in circles. These plants had thrived for millions of years already, and in the Jurassic they flourished across every continent, dominating the land with their strange, primeval forms. Ginkgos also shared this world, with their fan-shaped leaves that shimmered in the breeze. Some grew into tall trees, their branches spreading wide, while others remained smaller, clustered together in groves that looked almost delicate compared to the massive conifers around them. These plants would survive long after the Jurassic ended, and even today, ginkgo trees can still be found, living fossils that carry the memory of this ancient time in their leaves. Without flowers to attract butterflies, hummingbirds, or bees, pollination took on a different form. The air carried pollen like drifting dust, shaken loose by wind and scattered across the forest in unseen clouds. Beetles, too, played their part, crawling from cone to cone, feeding and carrying pollen as they moved. It was a slower, less precise system than the colorful partnerships that flowers and pollinators would one day create, but in this greenhouse world of endless abundance, it was enough. Life found a way, carried forward on breezes and the movements of small, armored insects. Imagine walking through such a forest. The air would feel thick and damp, heavy with the smell of resin and earth. Ferns grew in great blankets along the forest floor, their fronds curling and uncurling in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, weaving a living carpet beneath the towering trunks. Sunlight filtered down in narrow beams, catching on mist and highlighting patches of green, yet leaving much of the ground in deep shade. The silence would be broken not by birdsong, for true birds were only just beginning to appear, but by the low hum of insects and the rustle of leaves as herds of dinosaurs pushed their way through the undergrowth. This was a world of green, but not the green we know. Without blossoms, there were no splashes of red, pink, or yellow to break the canopy. Instead, there were layers upon layers of foliage, dark emerald needles above, lighter fronds below, and patches of pale lichen clinging to bark. Even the beauty of a sunrise or sunset would have painted the forests only in shifting tones of gold against green. To our modern eyes, it would feel alien, as though color itself was muted, waiting for the invention of flowers to awaken a brighter palette. The structure of these forests shaped the lives that moved within them. The towering conifers created shade where smaller plants struggled, forcing ferns and cycads to adapt to dim light. Dinosaurs with long necks, like Brachiosaurus, reached into the upper canopy to feed, stripping branches that few other creatures could reach. Others fed lower, sweeping their heads side to graze on cycads or ferns. Each layer of the forest offered its own resources, and each species found its place within the endless green. The air was filled not only with pollen but with moisture rising from the earth. Rain was frequent, feeding rivers that cut through the forests and flooded the plains. After storms, the ground would be slick with mud, the scent of pine and wet soil rising thick and strong. Insects thrived in this environment, filling the silence with their clicks, hums, and chirps, creating a chorus that echoed through the trunks. With no flowers to guide them, they moved between cones and fronds, carrying the ancient business of pollination forward. In this setting, life was both abundant and strange. The forests felt alive, but to us, they would also feel incomplete, as though something essential was missing. To imagine a world without flowers is to strip away one of the most familiar parts of our landscapes, one of the brightest signs of beauty. Yet here, in this ancient greenhouse, life thrived in spite of it, or perhaps because of it. These plants were survivors, adapted to storms, heat, and shifting soils, and they ruled the land long before blossoms ever appeared. From the silence of these green cathedrals, the story moves onward toward the creatures that would eventually break the quiet of the canopy with fragile wings, lifting from branches into the heavy Jurassic air. Among the endless green of conifers and cycads, where shadows stretched across the forest floor and giant footsteps left the ground trembling, another story was quietly unfolding. It did not belong to the walking mountains or the hunters that shook the trees. It belonged to something far more fragile. In the branches above, where shafts of sunlight pierced through the canopy and insects darted in shifting beams of light, wings were beginning to beat for the very first time. The creature known as Archaeopteryx is one of the most famous symbols of this transition. Fossils discovered in limestone quarries in Germany show an animal no larger than a crow, with delicate bones, sharp teeth, and claws on its wings. At first glance, it looked like a small dinosaur, yet its body was wrapped in feathers that spread from head to tail. Its wings carried the unmistakable shape of flight feathers, asymmetrical veins that could catch the air. Though it was awkward in comparison to the birds of today, Archaeopteryx represents a doorway, the moment life tested the skies with something new. The story of how feathers came to be tells us much about the journey to flight. They did not begin as instruments for soaring. Early feathers were simple filaments, soft strands that trapped air and provided insulation. They kept small dinosaurs warm in a world where nights could cool quickly after humid days. Over time, these filaments branched, becoming more complex, providing not only warmth, but also color and display. Patterns may have shimmered in the forest light, used to signal rivals or attract mates. Only later did these feathers evolve into the broad veins capable of catching the wind. Survival shaped them first for warmth, then for beauty, and finally, almost accidentally, for flight. To imagine Archaeopteryx is to see a creature caught between worlds. Its teeth and claws tie it to its dinosaur ancestors, while its feathers and wings point toward the future. It may not have been a powerful flyer, more likely gliding short distances between trees or fluttering to the ground in bursts of effort. Perhaps it climbed branches with its claws, spreading its wings to leap toward another trunk. Each attempt was a test of possibility, a fragile beating of wings that hinted at what would one day fill the skies. This transition from ground to air was not simple. Muscles, lungs, and bones all had to change. Archaeopteryx carried a wishbone, the fused clavicle that today strengthens the chest of every bird. Its bones were hollow, light enough to help it lift from the forest floor. Air sacs may have flowed through its body, making each breath more efficient, giving it the energy for sudden bursts of movement. These were the first building blocks of the avian body plan, laid down in small steps that would echo across millions of years. The emotional weight of these fragile flights is profound. While the giants shook the earth and predators ruled with teeth and claws, here was a creature whose strength lay in delicacy. Its survival was not through brute force, but through agility and adaptation. Imagine standing in the dim light of a Jurassic grove, watching as a small shape clambered up a trunk, spread its feathered arms, and leapt. The wings did not beat with the steady power of an eagle, but with uncertain strokes, fluttering enough to glide from branch to branch. Yet within that hesitation was the promise of everything to come, the first echo of birdsong that had not yet been born. Other feathered kin likely shared this stage, small relatives that also experimented with feathers and gliding. Some may have spread their limbs to reveal membranes or proto-wings, testing different forms of air travel. Evolution was experimenting wildly, sculpting many paths, until one finally found success. Each tiny creature that beat the air with feathers was part of a grand rehearsal, a preview of skies that would, one day, belong to birds entirely. The forests of the Jurassic were filled with sounds, but they were not yet filled with the chirps, whistles, and songs that we associate with bird life. Instead, the first birds moved silently, their wings whispering through leaves, their voices perhaps closer to hisses or croaks than to melody. Even so, their presence marked the beginning of a new era. Life was no longer bound only to earth and water, nor solely to leathery wings of pterosaurs. A new way of flying was beginning, more precise, more versatile, one that would survive long after the age of dinosaurs ended. To see those wings beating for the first time is to glimpse the fragility of beginnings. They were not the thunderous steps of sauropods or the fearsome jaws of hunters, but something quieter, something gentler. Yet in their quietness lay a resilience. From those tentative glides would rise flocks that one day painted the sky with endless motion, filling dawn and dusk with song. In the deep silence of the Jurassic forest, the fragile wings of the future were already unfolding, carrying forward a legacy that still surrounds us today every time we look up and see a bird trace the air. And from those delicate first flights, the story of life in the Jurassic moves back to the ground, where other small creatures also carved out their existence in the shadows, waiting for their chance to inherit the earth. Amid the towering sauropods that darkened the horizon and the predators that shattered forests with their strikes, another story was unfolding, one so small that it could easily be overlooked. While giants ruled the land, the seas, and the skies, the first true mammals were already alive, moving quietly in the shadows. They were tiny, fragile compared to the reptiles around them, yet within their small frames lay the sparks of a future that would outlast the age of dinosaurs. These mammals were no larger than shrews, mice, or small rats. Some may have fit into the palm of a hand, soft-bodied creatures darting between roots and ferns. They lived at night, when the heat of the Jurassic day gave way to cooler air. In the darkness, when most predators rested, these little survivors emerged to hunt for insects, scurrying across the forest floor with quick, nervous movements. Their teeth were already specialized, sharper and more varied than those of reptiles, designed to chew, tear, and grind a wide variety of food. This adaptability was their strength, allowing them to take advantage of opportunities that the giants ignored. Though they seem simple to us now, the mammals of the Jurassic were already beginning to diversify. Some evolved gliding membranes, stretching skin between their limbs to leap from branch to branch. their silhouettes passing like fleeting shadows through the treetops. Others adapted to burrowing, digging tunnels into soft earth where they could hide from danger and raise their young. Still others took to different diets, experimenting with seeds, roots, or small vertebrates. Evolution was already planting the seeds of variety, and though none of these creatures rivaled the dinosaurs in size, they carried within them the resilience and ingenuity that would one day reshape the planet. To imagine their world is to shrink yourself to their scale. The forest floor was a vast and dangerous wilderness where every fallen leaf could hide a predator and every shadow could conceal a claw. The footsteps of a passing sauropod might shake the ground so violently that soil crumbled into burrows and insects scattered in clouds. A sudden roar in the distance would freeze them in place, their tiny hearts pounding as echoes rumbled through the undergrowth. Yet, despite the danger, they endured, moving carefully, always alert, always ready to disappear into the safety of darkness or burrows. Their lives revolved around survival, but also around care. Unlike most reptiles, many of these early mammals likely nursed their young, feeding them with milk, protecting them within nests or burrows until they were strong enough to venture out. This parental care was part of what set them apart, giving the next generation a better chance in a world dominated by giants. A mother crouched in the dark, her small body curled around fragile pups, represented a different kind of strategy, one built not on size or strength, but on nurturing and persistence. It is easy to imagine the quiet moments that filled their nights. The soft rustle of fur against leaves, the quick snapping of jaws on beetles or moths, the gliding leap from one branch to another, a tiny shadow passing unnoticed beneath the stars. Where the great predators brought chaos and the sauropods brought thunder, these little mammals brought silence and subtlety. They thrived not by overpowering the world around them, but by slipping through the cracks, finding space where no one else bothered to look. Their story is important because it reminds us that survival does not always belong to the biggest or the strongest. In the Jurassic, it belonged just as much to the smallest, the ones who could adapt, who could hide, who could carve out a life in the quiet spaces left behind. These forgotten mammals carried with them the potential for something more. Though they were tiny sparks in a vast, storm-filled age, they would one day ignite into the lineages that gave rise to us. And as their tiny paws padded through the leaf litter and their eyes glimmered faintly in the moonlight, the forests around them remained alive with other voices, not the roars of predators or the bellows of giants this time, but the hum and click of insects that ruled the air, filling the night with a chorus that never truly fell silent. To walk through a Jurassic forest was not only to be surrounded by green, but also to be immersed in a soundscape that was as alive as the creatures themselves. Close your eyes and imagine it. The air is thick with heat and moisture, the trees rising like pillars all around you, and every corner of the world carries a voice. Some are subtle, barely noticed, while others roll like thunder through the valleys. It was a world that did not know silence. The first sounds would have come from the smallest of creatures. Insects filled the air with their constant hums, their wings vibrating in endless rhythm. Beetles clicked against bark, while giant dragonflies sliced the air with a low, buzzing whir, their wings shimmering as they darted between shafts of sunlight. Crickets may have chirped in the undergrowth, a chorus that rose and fell with the warmth of the night. To our ears, these sounds would feel strangely familiar, echoes of summer evenings today, yet sharper, louder, because the insects of the Jurassic grew larger and thrived in greater abundance. Layered over this background was the movement of the forests themselves. Leaves rustled as herds passed through, ferns swayed in the wake of long tails sweeping side to side, and branches cracked beneath the weight of creatures feeding high above. Every step of a sauropod pressed the earth, sending low vibrations through the soil, a sound felt as much in the body as it was heard. If you had stood in the shadows of such a herd, you would not have heard only their calls, but the deep groaning of trees bending and breaking as they reached for food, the forest reshaping itself in sound as well as in sight. Then there were the calls of the dinosaurs themselves. Sauropods, with lungs and necks longer than buses, may have produced low booming notes that carried for kilometers, deep resonant bellows rolling across plains to keep contact with distant herds. These sounds would not have been high-pitched roars, but bass notes that rippled like distant thunder, vibrating through the air and into the ground beneath your feet. Predators, too, filled the soundscape with their voices. Allosaurus may have let out sharp, guttural cries that pierced through the noise of insects, a warning or a declaration of territory. Smaller hunters likely chirped or barked to one another, signals in the dark as they coordinated their movements. Some paleontologists believe that many theropods, rather than roaring like lions, may have produced deep booming or even hissing sounds, closer to the calls of crocodiles and large birds today. Imagine a forest suddenly falling still as a low hiss echoes from the tree line, a predator announcing its presence without the need for sight. Along the coasts, the soundscape shifted again. Waves rolled against sandy shores and rocky cliffs, breaking into endless crashes that filled the air. Pterosaur colonies clinging to the cliffs would have added their own cacophony, shrieking and croaking as thousands of wings lifted into the air at once. Below, the waters themselves sang with motion, the splash of an ichthyosaur breaking the surface in pursuit of prey, the thud of a pliosaur's jaws closing around its catch. Even the quiet swish of long plesiosaur necks cutting through water might have been heard if you were close enough. The oceans boomed and hissed, each movement of waves and beasts adding to the rhythm. At night, the Jurassic did not fall silent. The insects grew louder, their hums swelling into a near-constant drone. Nocturnal mammals rustled in the undergrowth, their tiny paws tapping against leaves. Amphibians croaked from riverbanks and wetlands, voices echoing across still water. In the darkness, the sudden cry of a predator would have been even more chilling, breaking the hum of night into shards of fear. And above it all, the wind whispered through towering conifers, carrying with it the smell of resin and the breath of storms approaching. The soundscape of this world was unlike ours, not only in volume, but in its strangeness. Without birdsong, there were no melodic whistles or chirping choirs to greet the dawn. Instead, mornings were filled with booming calls, insect hums, and the crashing of waves. Midday hummed with the vibrations of wings, tails, and stomping feet. Nights belonged to croaks, hisses, and the heavy breathing of creatures too large to remain silent. It was a symphony both familiar and alien, a music of life in its rawest, oldest form. And though we can only reconstruct fragments of these sounds through fossils and comparisons to modern relatives, the truth is that the full voice of the Jurassic is lost to us forever. We will never stand in those forests and hear the exact resonance of a sauropod's call echo through the trees, or the precise hiss of a predator waiting in the dark. What remains are shadows, hints left in bones and impressions, guiding our imagination. The Jurassic was not just seen, it was heard, a world alive with voices we will never truly hear, but whose echoes still seem to hum faintly through the stones they left behind. From this chorus of ancient sounds, the story turns naturally toward the creatures that added texture to the air, not with roars or bellows, but with the constant buzz and flicker of wings, as insects rose to dominance in the skies of the Jurassic world. Above the hum of Jurassic forests and beneath the cries of giants, the air was alive with smaller voices, constant and unrelenting. They were not the calls of birds, for true birds were only just beginning to emerge, and they were not the leathery beats of pterosaur wings that cast vast shadows overhead. These sounds came from creatures far smaller, yet no less important, for they filled the world with a living background of clicks, hums, and buzzes. The insects of the Jurassic ruled the air in their own way, a restless, tireless presence that touched every corner of life. Dragonflies were among the most striking of these winged rulers, with long, slender bodies and translucent wings that shimmered like stained glass. They darted across wetlands and rivers with sudden, jerking movements. Some species grew large enough to rival the span of a human hand, and though not quite as immense as the giants of earlier ages, their presence in the Jurassic skies would have been impossible to ignore. Their flight was quick and precise, able to hover in place or rocket forward in bursts of speed. They were hunters of the air, their multifaceted eyes catching the glint of prey from meters away, their jaws snapping shut on mosquitoes, flies, and smaller insects. To stand near a Jurassic wetland would have been to hear their wings slicing through the air, a sharp, insistent buzzing that never truly faded. Beetles, too, thrived in staggering numbers. These creatures, small and sturdy, filled the undergrowth, the trunks of trees, and the air itself. Their shells shone in the filtered light, some dull brown and others catching iridescent colors. They fed on decaying wood, leaves, and dung, breaking down matter that would otherwise have choked the forest floor. Some crawled among conifer cones, feeding and carrying pollen, unknowingly keeping the ancient plants alive. Others became prey for reptiles, amphibians, and the tiny mammals that scurried in the shadows. To walk across a Jurassic forest floor would have been to hear the faint clicking of beetles' armored bodies brushing against bark, the quiet patter of dozens scrambling away beneath ferns, or the rasp of mandibles chewing through wood. Primitive flies also rose during this time, buzzing in clouds over rivers, lakes, and swamps. Their wings beat so quickly that the air seemed to shimmer with motion, their bodies drawn to water and decay. In swarms, they created an almost tangible hum, rising and falling with the warmth of the day. They served as food for dragonflies, amphibians, and even the earliest feathered dinosaurs that snapped at them as they flitted past. These flies were part of a cycle of life that never ceased, breeding in water, rising into the air, and becoming nourishment for countless others. Their sound was a reminder that life was always in motion, always vibrating just beneath the roar of giants. The roles of these insects stretched far beyond simple noise. They were pollinators before bees, carrying grains of pollen on their shells and legs, linking plant to plant in slow, clumsy exchanges. Without them, conifers, cycads, and ginkgos would have struggled to reproduce in the vast stretches of forest. They were scavengers too, breaking down carcasses and waste, recycling nutrients back into the soil, feeding plants that in turn nourished the herds of sauropods. Insects were everywhere, woven into every cycle, their presence essential even though they could be crushed beneath the weight of a single dinosaur's foot. To imagine the soundscape of the Jurassic without these creatures is impossible. Their buzzing, clicking, and droning created a constant background, a living hum that wrapped around every other sound. The earth shook with the steps of giants, the skies split with the shrieks of pterosaurs, yet beneath it all lay this tireless chorus. It was the music of survival on a smaller scale, each insect performing its part without pause. For the small mammals that crept out at night, Insects were food, their sounds guiding tiny hunters through the dark. For amphibians in rivers and wetlands, swarming flies meant sustenance. For plants, beetles were reluctant allies, carrying life from one cone to another. And for the forests themselves, these creatures were caretakers, ensuring that what died returned to the soil, keeping the endless cycle unbroken. If you closed your eyes in a Jurassic Valley, the noise would never fade. The faint whir of dragonfly wings would cut through the air near your ear. The persistent hum of flies would rise like a tide, swelling at dusk when swarms thickened. The clicking of beetles in the undergrowth would create a hidden rhythm, faint but steady. Together, these sounds formed a backdrop that no storm or predator could silence. They were the heartbeat of the forest, small voices adding up to something immense. And so, the Jurassic world was not only one of colossal footsteps and roaring predators, it was also one of endless whispers, buzzes, and clicks, the voices of creatures so small that they are often forgotten, yet so essential that the world could not have thrived without them. The giants may have ruled the land, but the air itself belonged to the insects, an unbroken chorus that filled every moment of the day and night. From this living hum, the story drifts downward, closer to the ground and into the rivers, lakes, and wetlands, where another community of life waited, shaping the flow of ecosystems with scales, fins, and croaks from the waters that cut across the Jurassic landscape. Between the towering forests and the endless seas stretched another kind of world, one that pulsed with water. Rivers carved their way through valleys, braiding across floodplains that spread wide beneath the humid Jurassic skies. Lakes shimmered in lowlands, some so broad that they looked like inland seas, while wetlands stretched for kilometers, filled with reeds, ferns, and mosses. These places were alive with motion and sound, rich with life that thrived not in the open ocean, nor on the forest floor, but in the cool, shallow waters that linked the two. Along the banks, early crocodile ancestors sprawled under the sunlight, their armored backs glistening in the light. These reptiles were smaller and more varied than the crocodiles we know today, some with long, slender snouts built for snapping fish, others shorter and heavier, with jaws designed to crush hard-shelled prey. They lurked silently in muddy shallows, their eyes and nostrils just above the surface, waiting for fish or small dinosaurs to wander too close. When the moment came, they would lunge with startling speed, the still water erupting into froth as powerful jaws clamped shut. These creatures were survivors, ancient predators whose lineage would stretch forward across millions of years, outlasting even the mighty dinosaurs. Amphibians thrived here too, flourishing in the damp margins of rivers and lakes. Giant salamander-like forms, some longer than a grown man, swam with slow, undulating movements, their bodies blending easily into the murky waters. Frogs and toads, though smaller, already played their part, filling the nights with croaks and calls that echoed across wetlands. Their skin drank the moisture of the air, their bodies tied closely to the rhythms of water, dependent on pools and streams to breed and survive. In these creatures, we see echoes of a world even older, when amphibians were the first to crawl from the seas onto land. The rivers themselves were rich with freshwater fish, schools moving like liquid silver beneath the surface. Some had armor-plated scales that glinted when light struck just right, while others carried jaws filled with teeth sharp enough to tear into smaller prey. Their movements stirred the waters, attracting hunters from above and below. Pterosaurs may have circled overhead, swooping down to skim fish from the surface, while crocodile-like reptiles lunged from below. The fish were both predator and prey, weaving themselves into the web of life that made these wetlands so vibrant. Floodplains stretched wide along these waterways, places where the rivers spilled over during heavy rains, leaving behind rich soils thick with nutrients. These plains became grazing grounds for herds of dinosaurs who followed the seasonal rhythms of wet and dry, moving with the floods in search of food. The ground here was softer, dotted with pools that reflected the sky, and lined with ferns that grew quickly after each flood. Herds of sauropods may have marched along these plains, leaving trails of footprints that hardened into stone. Predators would have followed, drawn not only by the prey itself, but also by the smaller creatures that flourished in the mud and water. Wetlands provided more than food. They were nurseries, places where amphibians laid their eggs in shallow pools, where insects swarmed in clouds above the reeds, and where young dinosaurs may have taken their first steps near the safety of cover and water. The air buzzed with life, each ripple and splash carrying meaning. A sudden silence might mean the presence of a lurking predator. A quick flurry of wings might mean a swarm of flies disturbed by movement below. Every sound was part of the constant dialogue of survival. The wetlands were also treacherous. Deep mud could trap the unwary, pulling smaller dinosaurs down into muck where escape was impossible. Pools that looked calm could conceal the waiting bulk of a predator. Yet even with these dangers, life thrived here, for water was always the heart of survival. It drew animals from far and wide, shaping their paths across the landscape. To follow the rivers was to follow the very arteries of the Jurassic world. Imagine standing at the edge of one of these lakes at dusk. The water glows orange in the fading sunlight. Dragonflies skim the surface, frogs croak from the shadows, and ripples spread as fish break the surface for insects. In the distance, the deep rumble of a sauropod herd carries faintly on the air, while closer by, the sudden splash of a crocodile ancestor reminds you of the hidden dangers beneath the calm. It was a world of constant motion, built on water, sustained by its floods and flows, every drop feeding into the cycles of life. And as rivers wound their way through forests and plains, they linked ecosystems together, tying the land into one great living web. From the hush of wetlands, the story moves naturally to the nesting grounds of giants, where even the largest creatures began life as fragile eggs laid in the sand and soil along these ancient shores. Across the Jurassic world, where forests stretched to the horizon and rivers cut through fertile floodplains, life always returned to one of its most delicate stages. For all the size and power of the dinosaurs, even the largest of them began in silence, inside fragile shells, no thicker than a coin. Fossilized egg beds found across continents tell us that giants were born not in thunder, but in stillness, laid carefully in the sand, soil, or ash of ancient landscapes. These nesting grounds are more than scattered eggs. Some cover vast areas, whole colonies of dinosaurs returning to the same place year after year. In Argentina, in India, and in other corners of the world, paleontologists have uncovered sites filled with hundreds of nests, layered over one another across time, each generation leaving behind traces of its efforts to continue life. To stand at such a site today is to look upon a stone memory of family, of survival, of beginnings repeated endlessly across millions of years. Sauropods, the walking mountains of the Jurassic, approached reproduction differently from the caregiving mammals of our world. Their eggs were small compared to their bodies, often no larger than a soccer ball, despite parents that could stretch 30 meters in length. Instead of producing a few large, well-protected young, sauropods laid many eggs at once. Some clutches may have contained dozens, spread across shallow pits dug into sandy floodplains or volcanic ash. The strategy was clear: Survival came not from protecting every hatchling, but from creating numbers so great that at least some would escape predation and grow to adulthood. Theropods, the hunters of the age, often laid smaller clutches but displayed behaviors that hint at more direct care. Fossilized nests show eggs arranged in circular patterns, carefully placed and sometimes preserved alongside the skeletal remains of adults. It suggests that some predators, perhaps even the ancestors of birds, brooded their nests, guarding them with their own bodies and regulating temperature with feathers or skin. Others may have stood close by, shielding the fragile shells from scavengers or the shifting weather of the Jurassic. These small gestures tell us that not every dinosaur relied solely on numbers. Some invested effort in protecting a few young, ensuring their survival through care and attention. Hatchlings were vulnerable. When they cracked through their shells, they were far from the giants they would become. A newborn sauropod may have weighed only a few kilograms, its neck and limbs spindly, its movements uncertain. Yet within decades, it could rise into a creature that shook the earth. Fossilized trackways sometimes preserve the tiny prints of young dinosaurs walking alongside adults, evidence that some herds may have protected their young by keeping them in the center, surrounded by walls of muscle and bone. Others may have been left to fend for themselves almost immediately, relying on instincts and quick growth to survive in a world filled with predators. The emotional contrast is striking. A herd of colossal Brachiosaurus, necks towering above the trees, may have returned each year to the same sandy plain, their immense shadows stretching across the land. Yet at their feet lay clusters of eggs, fragile ovals warmed by the sunlight, no stronger than a bird's egg today. Within them, the heartbeat of the future pulsed quietly, vulnerable to rain, to predators, to chance. Even the mightiest creatures began life this way, as fragile shells on shifting ground, their survival balanced on uncertainty. Predators prowled these nesting sites, drawn to the smell of eggs and the chance for an easy meal. Crocodile ancestors, small theropods, and even mammals may have raided nests, scattering shells and leaving behind fragments that hardened into fossils. Some nests bear scars of these raids, broken shells that never hatched, tiny bones preserved where life ended before it began. Yet many others succeeded, enough to fill the forests, plains, and skies with creatures that would define the Jurassic. The nesting grounds also shaped the land itself. Repeated generations of nesting churned soils, fertilized by the remains of shells and dung, creating fertile patches where plants thrived. These fertile oases drew herbivores back again and again, not just to lay eggs, but to feed on the abundance that sprang up around them. In this way, reproduction was not only about continuing life, but about reshaping the landscape, leaving behind ecosystems that pulsed with energy. To imagine such a place is to step softly into a valley filled with low mounds of sand, each marked by the round outlines of buried eggs. The air is thick with heat, the smell of damp soil rising after a recent storm. Adult dinosaurs move slowly across the plain, their massive forms keeping a quiet watch. At your feet, you might hear the faint tapping from within a shell, the sound of a hatchling struggling to meet the world. And then, with a final crack, a tiny head pushes through, blinking in the light for the first time. Even giants began like this, not with the thunder of footsteps, but with the fragile breath of a newborn, cradled by a shell that could so easily break. And from these beginnings, the world of the Jurassic continued to grow, carrying us into moments when predator and prey collided, and the evidence of those struggles would be written forever into stone. Across the Jurassic landscape, every chase, every strike, and every desperate attempt to survive left marks. Most of these moments vanished as soon as they ended, lost to the flow of time, washed away by storms, or buried beneath new growth. Yet sometimes the earth itself kept a record. Today, we read those records in stone, where trackways and fossilized bones preserve flashes of drama that once shook the land. They are windows into moments of struggle, frozen for millions of years, the silent echoes of predator and prey. In some regions, vast plains of hardened mud display trackways stretching for hundreds of meters. These tracks are not random, they tell stories. You can see the long, sweeping strides of a sauropod herd, their enormous feet pressing deeply into the wet ground, each print larger than a dinner table. Alongside, smaller three-toed impressions reveal the presence of theropods, following at a distance. The difference in size alone is striking. One step from a sauropod could cover meters of ground, while the predator's prints, though sharp and clawed, fall lightly between. Paleontologists study these trails and imagine the tension of that moment, the hunters shadowing the herd, waiting for weakness, waiting for a chance. Some trackways capture the chase itself. In one famous site, the footprints of a herbivorous dinosaur suddenly change direction, lengthening into a desperate run. Behind them, the sharp-toed prints of a predator overlap, closing the distance. You can almost feel the pounding of the ground, the surge of energy as prey tried to flee and predator gave pursuit. The chase ends abruptly, the tracks of both animals vanishing where the ground was torn apart. Did the predator succeed? Did the prey escape into cover? The stone does not say. It leaves us only with the moment, suspended forever in the patterns of ancient mud. Bones tell their own stories, often more intimate and haunting than trackways. Fossils of sauropods have been found with deep gouges cut into their bones, marks made by teeth as predators tore at their flesh. Some of these marks show signs of healing. The bone grew back unevenly, scarred but alive, meaning the giant survived an attack and carried the wound for the rest of its life. Others show no healing at all, the attack fatal, the story ending in jaws that left scars written into stone. Even predators carry the evidence of these battles. Skulls of Allosaurus have been found with fractures, bones cracked as if from the impact of a tail or the blow of another hunter's jaws. Some show infections that spread slowly until they became life-ending. Others healed, leaving the animal scarred but still capable of killing. These fossils remind us that predators lived dangerous lives too, always at risk of injury from prey that refused to die quietly. To bring down a giant was not easy, and even success came with terrible costs. The most haunting fossils are those that capture predator and prey together. In rare instances, skeletons have been found locked in combat, their bodies frozen in the act of struggle. One specimen shows a small predator grasping the limb of its prey, jaws still clenched, as both were buried suddenly, perhaps by a flood or a collapsing dune. These discoveries are like photographs in stone, preserving not just bones, but the drama of life and death at its most raw. When you stand before such fossils, it is easy to imagine the sounds that once filled that moment. The crash of undergrowth as prey fled, the guttural hiss of a predator lunging forward, the ground vibrating under the weight of pursuit. Then the impact, the desperate flailing of limbs, the ripping of teeth, the shuddering breath of survival, or the silence of defeat. The stone carries none of these sounds, but it holds the shapes, the positions, the marks that let us glimpse them in our minds. These frozen moments remind us that the Jurassic world was not only filled with towering creatures and endless forests, but also with constant tension, a daily test of survival where every encounter could shift the balance. The trackways and the bones show us more than anatomy. They show us drama. They show us stories of fear, of hunger, of courage, and of desperation. And from these silent struggles pressed into stone, the path leads us onward into the skies again, where storms gathered with fury, shaping migrations, feeding rivers, and changing the rhythms of life in ways as powerful as any predator's strike. When we imagine the Jurassic world, it is easy to picture the giants of the forests or the hunters lurking in the shadows, but above all of this was a sky that never rested. The atmosphere itself was a living force, shaping the lives of every creature below. Without polar ice to temper the climate, heat rose unhindered, and the air swelled heavy with moisture. This warmth gave birth to skies crowded with clouds, rolling and building into storms that could sweep across entire continents. Monsoon rains were a rhythm of life. When they came, they did not fall gently, but in torrents that transformed the land. Sheets of water poured from the sky for days, swelling rivers until they spilled into floodplains, spreading rich soil across the land and feeding the endless growth of plants. Herds of sauropods would have moved toward these renewed pastures, their migrations drawn by the sudden flush of green. Smaller herbivores followed, grazing on ferns and cycads that sprang to life almost overnight. With the herbivores came predators, circling the edges of the herds, all bound to the pulse of water falling from the heavens. But these rains could also destroy. Floodwaters carved new channels through the land, sweeping away nests and young too small to escape. Low valleys became lakes in the space of hours, drowning plants and trapping animals. The storms gave with one hand and took with the other, nurturing and erasing in the same breath. The skies themselves glowed with energy, with so much heat rising from the steaming earth. Lightning split the heavens with frightening frequency. Great forks of light tore across cloud banks, striking forests and setting fires that raged through the undergrowth. These flames were part of the cycle too, clearing space for new growth, releasing nutrients back into the soil. Imagine standing in the half-light of a storm, the air crackling, the smell of ozone sharp in your nose, as lightning lashes a conifer, sending fire racing up its resin-rich trunk. For the animals of the Jurassic, this spectacle was not rare, but familiar, part of the constant dance of storm and flame. For creatures that migrated, the storms were signposts. The return of monsoon rains signaled the time to move, guiding herds across floodplains that had been barren weeks before. The drying of rivers forced them onward again, pushing life into an endless circuit, always in pursuit of food and water. Even predators were tied to these cycles, following the migrations of their prey, adapting to feast when the land was rich, and to endure when storms shifted the balance. Above it all, pterosaurs soared, riding the thermals that rose from hot earth. These giant flyers would have been intimately connected to the weather, using updrafts to travel great distances, but also vulnerable when storms churned the air into chaos. A colony clinging to seaside cliffs might have been shattered in an instant by a sudden squall, wings battered, chicks torn from nests. The same winds that lifted them high could just as easily send them crashing into the sea. The emotional weight of these skies is difficult to overstate. The Jurassic atmosphere was a force both nurturing and merciless, able to sustain giants by feeding forests, yet capable of ending lives in moments with floods, fire, and lightning. To live beneath such skies was to live with constant uncertainty, watching horizons darken, feeling the sudden shift of wind, and knowing that the difference between survival and destruction could be measured in a single storm. Even nights were touched by this restless sky. Imagine lying in a valley as thunder rolled endlessly above, flashes of light illuminating the silhouettes of dinosaurs moving silently through the rain. The ground trembles not from footsteps this time, but from the percussion of the heavens themselves, drumming a rhythm that shaped the heartbeat of the world. The sky of the Jurassic was not empty space above. It was a living canvas, painted with clouds, storms, and fire, a presence that dictated migrations, sculpted landscapes, and even influenced the evolution of creatures below. From this restless dome, the story flows back downward once again, to the colors and textures of a world lit not only by lightning and rain, but by the strange and vivid hues carried in the bodies of the creatures themselves. When we imagine the Jurassic, we often paint it in shades of green and brown, the forests dim beneath the canopy, the giants cloaked in muted colors that blend with the earth. Yet science now reveals that this ancient world was far more vibrant than we once believed, filled with hues that shimmered in sunlight and glowed beneath storm-heavy skies. Fossils do not only preserve bones and teeth. In some, microscopic traces of pigments remain, tiny structures that whisper of the colors these creatures once wore. From these delicate clues, a palette emerges, a Jurassic canvas brighter and stranger than anything our imaginations first dared to dream. Some small feathered dinosaurs, close relatives of birds, carried pigments that modern researchers have matched to colors we still see today. Reddish browns, sleek blacks, and shimmering iridescence may have patterned their bodies, turning them into living displays as much as hunters or prey. Imagine Archaeopteryx not in dull grays, but with feathers tipped in dark hues, perhaps flashing with subtle shine as it spread its wings in the dim light of the forest. These pigments suggest that even in the Jurassic, color was more than camouflage. It was communication, attraction, intimidation. Life was painting itself boldly on the canvas of survival. The plants that formed the backdrop of this age contributed their own shades to the scenery. Conifers stretched skyward, their needles creating walls of deep emerald. Ginkgo groves shimmered with fan-shaped leaves that turned golden before they fell, spreading carpets of light across the ground. Cycads stood stout and proud, their stiff leaves gleaming in sunlight, catching drops of rain that sparkled like jewels after storms. Ferns unfurled their fronds in every direction, adding soft layers of green beneath the towering trees. These forests were not dull. They were living cathedrals painted in countless tones of green, each shifting with the light of day. Above them, the skies carried their own dramatic palette. In a greenhouse world, sunsets burned with intensity, the air thick with moisture, scattering light into fiery shades. The end of each day might have been a blaze of crimson and orange, the horizon glowing, while the silhouettes of pterosaurs glided across it. Storm clouds, swollen with energy, bruised the sky with purples and steel blues, their edges rimmed with gold as lightning split them apart. Even nights may have glowed differently, with clear skies revealing constellations millions of years older than the ones we recognize, their pale light silvering the forests below. The oceans of the Jurassic added yet another layer to this palette. Warm and shallow seas shone turquoise where sunlight penetrated, the water alive with shoals of silver-scaled fish and coiled ammonites gleaming in their shells. Deeper waters turned to endless sapphire, a blue that seemed bottomless, hiding the shadows of pliosaurs and ichthyosaurs waiting in the gloom. Coral-like reefs shimmered with color, filled with invertebrates that added texture to the marine palette. When storms struck, waves crashed white against rocky coasts, scattering foam that glowed like molten glass under the sunlight. The creatures themselves added bursts of unexpected hues. Fossil evidence suggests that some small dinosaurs may have carried stripes or spots, blending patterns of rust red, charcoal, and sandy yellow. Perhaps herds of herbivores carried subtle markings that helped them identify one another, or predators bore bold flashes of color meant to startle or confuse. Even the giants, though often imagined as gray, may have worn earthy tones patterned to blend with forests or floodplains. The possibility of blues and iridescent greens glinting on scales or feathers cannot be ruled out, turning these animals into living tapestries beneath the Jurassic sunlight. To stand within this world would have been to feel surrounded by color at every scale: the deep emerald of towering conifers, the golden carpets of fallen ginkgo leaves, the fiery skies lit by storms and sunsets, the endless blues of warm seas. Against this backdrop moved creatures painted by nature's hand, their bodies alive with pigments, their feathers and scales glinting in ways both strange and familiar. It was not a muted earth, but one vibrant and bold, with colors that signaled danger, invited mates, or simply dazzled the eye. And so the Jurassic unfolds in our imagination not as a world washed in monotone, but as a place alive with brilliance. Each storm, each forest, each ocean wave painted in shades more vivid than we once believed. From these colors, the story continues into the rhythm of daily life itself, the rise and fall of creatures across the long span of a single day, from dawn's first light to the shadows of night. The Jurassic world was alive not only in its storms and its forests, but in the steady rhythm of its creatures. Each day unfolded in cycles of movement, rest, feeding, and survival, a pattern as familiar to life then as it is to us now. To step into a single day among the dinosaurs is to feel the pulse of an ancient earth, beating with the calls of giants and the whispers of predators that lurked at the edges. As dawn spread its light across the horizon, the first sounds to rise were not the booming roars of giants, but the smaller voices that filled the background. Insects stirred, their wings humming as they warmed themselves in the growing heat. Amphibians croaked in rivers and wetlands, their calls carrying faintly through the mist. From the canopy came the flutter of early birds and their kin, fragile wings cutting through the morning air. But soon, the deeper voices joined in, echoing across valleys and plains. Low bellows rolled from sauropod herds, long-necked giants calling to one another as they began their day's march toward fresh grazing grounds. These herds moved slowly, grazing with patience, stripping foliage from conifers and cycads as they walked. Their feeding was not scattered but organized, often sweeping in broad arcs across the land, reshaping forests as they passed. Every bite pulled down branches, every step pressed new paths into the earth. The herds were more than gatherings of giants. They were families, with young sheltered at the center, protected by the walls of adults. Their constant movement created a rhythm that stretched across seasons, following food as it grew with rains, then moving on again when the land was stripped bare. As the sunlight climbed higher, other creatures stirred. Stegosaurs emerged from groves, their plated backs glinting faintly in the morning light. Smaller herbivores, fleet-footed and cautious, grazed on ferns closer to the forest floor, always alert for signs of danger. Their ears flicked at the faintest sounds, their eyes scanning the tree line for movement. These smaller grazers lived their lives in vigilance, balancing every mouthful of food against the chance of a predator's strike. Predators did not waste energy on constant hunting. In a world where each chase could mean injury or exhaustion, strategy was everything. Allosaurs, the hunters of giants, often waited in the shadows, conserving their strength. They chose their moments carefully, watching herds for weakness, circling where the young or the sick fell behind. Their calls were not constant but deliberate, guttural warnings or signals carried between individuals. Many attacks may have begun not in midday heat, but in the cooler hours, when energy stretched further and shadows gave cover. As the day wore on, Heat pressed heavily onto the land. Dinosaurs, like the mammals that would one day follow them, needed rest. Sauropods may have slowed their grazing, standing silently in clusters, their long necks swaying lazily as they chewed. Smaller creatures sought shade, pressing into the shelter of ferns or conifer trunks. Even predators often retreated, lying low to conserve energy while the air shimmered with heat. The midday quiet was deceptive. It was not peace, but patience, a pause before movement resumed. When evening fell, the forests and plains stirred again. Herds moved toward rivers and wetlands, drinking deeply after their long marches. The sunset painted the sky with burning colors, and as its light faded, new voices began to rise. The night belonged to the watchful, the cautious, and the hunters. Small mammals padded through leaf litter, sniffing out insects. Amphibians called louder, their voices carrying over still water. In the darkness, predators prepared. The cooler air allowed them to move with endurance, their eyes glinting in the faint light of the moon and stars. Midnight in the Jurassic was not silent. The heavy footfalls of a predator broke through the hum of insects, startling herds that shifted uneasily in the dark. Some herbivores may have rested standing, swaying slightly as they dozed, while others lay in the shelter of trees, their young huddled close. Every shadow carried risk, every movement carried weight. A sudden cry split the night, the strike of predator on prey, the struggle ending in sounds that faded back into the hum of the forest. The cycle continued, day after day, each sunrise and sunset marking the endless rhythm of survival. From the booming calls that greeted dawn to the whispers of insects beneath the stars, the daily life of dinosaurs was a world in motion, a world of constant balance between energy, hunger, and endurance. And from this rhythm of survival, the story narrows further still, down to the smallest details beneath the giant's feet, where even the forest floors were alive with their own hidden worlds. Beneath the towering conifers and the swaying necks of giants, the Jurassic world carried another realm, one less visible but no less vital. At ground level, where shadows stretched long and shafts of sunlight pierced the canopy in scattered beams, the forest floor was alive with creatures whose smallness made them easy to overlook. Yet here, in the damp soil and tangled undergrowth, life wove the hidden threads that bound the ecosystem together. Every rustle, every flicker of movement carried meaning. Lizards darted across roots and fallen logs, their scaled bodies catching the light as they slipped between ferns. They were quick, always alert, their survival dependent on speed and agility rather than size. Some grew no longer than a hand, blending seamlessly into bark and leaves. Others reached lengths closer to a meter, their muscular tails whipping behind them as they hunted for insects or fled from predators. Their movements created sudden flashes of life on the forest floor, tiny sparks of energy that filled the gaps left between the heavy steps of giants. Amphibians thrived in the dampness of this world. Salamander-like forms lurked beneath stones, their skin moist and gleaming, their bodies tied to the water that pooled after storms. Frogs crouched low in the shadows, their throats swelling as they called out, croaks echoing softly through the ferns. These creatures were reminders of a time even older, when the first animals crawled from seas to land, and in the Jurassic they remained tied to both, at home in the shallows as much as in the soil. They hunted insects, became prey for lizards, and carried the cycle of life forward in their quiet persistence. Scavengers crept through the leaf litter, feeding on what others left behind. Beetles burrowed into rotting wood, breaking it down into soil that nourished the next generation of plants. Tiny mammals, no larger than mice, scurried through the shadows, their whiskers twitching as they searched for beetle larvae or discarded scraps of meat. Centipedes, long and armored with countless legs, moved silently under the cover of darkness, their venomous bites striking down smaller prey. Even millipedes, harmless and slow, played their part, chewing through decayed leaves, recycling nutrients back into the earth. Each movement, however small, carried weight in this hidden world. The micro-ecosystems beneath the giant's feet were complex and delicate. When a sauropod passed through, its massive feet pressed deep into the ground, crushing plants and leaving behind footprints large enough to hold small pools of water. In these depressions, frogs might lay their eggs, insects might swarm, and algae might bloom, transforming a single step into a temporary oasis. Fallen branches from storms became miniature forests of their own, crawling with beetles, worms, and fungi, feeding the soil that in turn fed the towering trees. Even dung from the giants provided sustenance, attracting swarms of insects and the small creatures that fed on them, ensuring nothing went to waste. To imagine this world is to lower yourself to the ground, where the air feels cooler and the scents stronger. The smell of damp earth and resin drifts upward, mixing with the sweetness of decaying plants. Every inch of soil holds motion, though much of it is too small to see at a glance. Look closer, and you would find colonies of ants tunneling through the ground, termites chewing their way through wood, and countless tiny organisms recycling the debris of the forest. This living carpet was the quiet foundation upon which the giants above depended, though they may never have noticed. Emotion runs deep in these overlooked lives. It is tempting to focus only on the massive creatures that shook the earth, but it was here, beneath them, that the true fabric of survival was woven. Without scavengers, the forest would have choked on their own waste. Without insects and amphibians, predators would have starved. Without lizards and small mammals, the balance of prey and predator would have faltered. These small, unnoticed lives were threads that stitched the Jurassic world together, fragile yet essential. And so, as giants marched and predators stalked, the ground beneath them pulsed with a quieter energy, one built from scales, claws, and soft amphibian skin. From the click of beetles' jaws to the rustle of leaves under tiny paws, the forest floor was not an afterthought. It was a world of its own, layered beneath the grandeur above, and from these micro-ecosystems rose the stability that made the age of giants possible. From here, the story stretches again to the defenses that evolved among the larger creatures, the strange armors and spikes that turned dinosaurs into walking fortresses against the dangers that pressed in from all sides. Among the herds of gentle grazers and the shadows of prowling predators, there existed dinosaurs that seemed to wear their survival on their skin. They were not built for speed like the fleet-footed herbivores, nor for towering dominance like the sauropods, but for defense. Their bodies carried plates, spikes, and armor so unusual that they look almost like sculptures of bone and horn, designs that seem both bizarre and beautiful. These were the living fortresses of the Jurassic, creatures whose very presence told predators to think twice. The Stegosaurus is perhaps the most striking of these defensive oddities. Its body, though heavy and low, was decorated with 2 rows of massive plates running down its back, rising like jagged sails from its neck to the tip of its tail. Each plate could reach a height taller than a grown man's torso, their edges catching the light of the Jurassic sunlight. For many years, paleontologists puzzled over their purpose. Were they armor, radiators to control heat, or bright displays meant to intimidate rivals and attract mates? The answer may have been a combination. These plates, richly supplied with blood vessels, could have flushed red when the animal was agitated, turning its back into a living warning signal, a visual shout across the plains. If the plates were for show, the tail left no doubt about its function. At the end of Stegosaurus's tail lay the thagomizer, a cluster of long, sharp spikes, some over a meter in length. Fossil evidence shows that these spikes were not mere ornaments. Some predator bones have been discovered with puncture wounds that match the size and shape of Stegosaurus spikes, proof that these tails were swung with deadly accuracy. Imagine the sight: a predator circling too close, the massive herbivore swinging its tail in a blur of bone and power, the spikes striking with force enough to pierce flesh and break bone. One well-placed strike could mean the difference between survival and death. Stegosaurus was not alone in its peculiar defenses. Other dinosaurs of the Jurassic also experimented with armor and intimidation. Some carried rows of spines jutting from their shoulders and flanks, warning any attacker that a bite would come at a painful cost. Others bore thickened skin reinforced with bony plates, creating natural shields across their backs. These adaptations made them less appealing targets, predators choosing instead the weaker, unarmored members of a herd. In a world where every meal came with risk, the sight of gleaming spikes or armored hides could be enough to turn a hunter away. Even the posture of these dinosaurs added to their defenses. Stegosaurus, with its small head and sloping back, may have appeared slow and clumsy at first glance, but the low angle of its body kept its vulnerable underside close to the ground, difficult to attack. Its plates, rising high, made it look larger than it truly was, a visual illusion of bulk that could discourage predators before a strike was even attempted. These animals did not rely on running or hiding. They stood their ground, their very forms warning the world that they were not easy prey. To witness such a creature in its environment would have been awe-inspiring. Picture a herd of stegosaurs grazing on a floodplain, their plates glowing faintly in the light of sunset. The air is heavy with the hum of insects, the rumble of distant thunder rolling across the sky. A predator approaches from the tree line, circling cautiously. The herd shifts, tails swinging slowly in unison, spikes catching the light like spears. The predator hesitates, calculating the risk. The message is clear without a sound. One wrong move, and bone will meet flesh. These defensive oddities remind us that survival in the Jurassic was not only about size or strength, but also about adaptation and ingenuity. Evolution sculpted armor and weapons from bone itself, creating creatures that looked like fortresses brought to life. Their defenses were not only physical but also psychological, shaping the behavior of predators and altering the balance of the ecosystem. And while the plates and spikes of these dinosaurs stood as warnings, the oceans beyond carried their own dazzling displays, not of armor or weapons, but of beauty and diversity, where countless species swam in waters alive with both danger and wonder. When we think of Jurassic oceans, it is easy to picture only the monsters, the pliosaurs with their crushing jaws, the ichthyosaurs that sliced through the waves like living torpedoes. Yet these waters held more than giants. Beneath the shadows of predators, the seas teemed with smaller lives, dazzling in their variety, delicate in their balance, and vital to the story of survival. To dive into these oceans is to find not only terror but also beauty, a world built on countless small creatures whose lives gave shape to the entire ecosystem. Schools of fish shimmered like liquid silver, darting in perfect unison as they twisted through shallow waters. Each fish was small, no longer than a hand, yet together they formed walls of motion, a defense against predators that hunted from every direction. Some carried armor-like scales, thick and gleaming, turning aside the bites of smaller hunters. Others evolved sleek bodies built for speed, vanishing into the dark with a flick of their tails. These fish were the heart of the food chain, feeding on plankton and smaller invertebrates, while themselves becoming food for reptiles, sharks, and seabirds that skimmed the waves. Among them drifted ammonites, creatures whose spiral shells coiled tighter with every year of growth. Some were small enough to fit into a palm, while others grew larger than wagon wheels, their shells ribbed and ridged with intricate patterns. These relatives of squid and octopus floated on the currents, their tentacles reaching outward to grasp passing prey. Their shells, often marked with dazzling colors, may have shimmered beneath the sunlight as they swam in schools of their own, twisting like galaxies of living spirals. For predators, ammonites were both a challenge and a prize. Their hard shells offered protection, but for those with the strength to crack them, they provided rich nourishment. Early sharks also swam these waters, their sleek bodies cutting silently through the depths. They were not yet the colossal predators that would one day dominate Earth's seas, but their presence was unmistakable. Some were no longer than a man's arm, sharp-toothed hunters preying on fish and invertebrates. Others grew larger, more formidable, prowling coasts and reefs with the patience of shadows. Their teeth, shed continuously, rained down onto the seafloor, where they would remain as fossils, long after their owners were gone. These sharks played a role as both hunters and scavengers, shaping the balance of life beneath the waves. The Jurassic seas were not only places of open water. In many regions, coral-like reefs spread outward in dazzling gardens. Built not by modern corals but by different organisms, these structures still created havens of life, sheltering countless species within their nooks and crevices. Brightly colored fish flickered among the reefs, nibbling on algae or snapping up plankton. Crustaceans scuttled across the sandy bottoms, their claws clicking as they searched for food. Sea urchins, starfish, and sponges clung to rock and reef alike, each playing a part in a network so dense it seemed alive with constant motion. Imagine drifting through one of these shallow reef systems. Sunlight beams down in golden shafts, striking shells and scales until the water itself seems to glow. The ammonites spiral past like drifting lanterns, fish scatter in shimmering bursts, and crabs dart sideways into crevices. Every corner holds life, every surface is busy. It is a world not of terror but of dazzling diversity, where survival is written in tiny movements and constant interaction. Even the seabed beneath told a story of richness. Bivalves burrowed into sand, filtering water through their shells. Worms tunneled beneath the surface, turning over the soil of the sea as beetles did on land. Their presence, quiet and unseen, kept the ecosystem stable, recycling nutrients that would rise again through the food chain. Without these small, tireless workers, the oceans could not have supported the giants above. The Jurassic seas remind us that life's story is not written only in the jaws of predators. It is written in the shimmer of fish scales, the curl of ammonite shells, the quiet click of crustacean claws, the endless flutter of creatures too small to name. Beneath the surface of waters that seemed ruled by monsters, an entire hidden world thrived, intricate and delicate, dazzling in its complexity. And from these glittering depths, the rhythm of survival continued onto land, where herds of dinosaurs followed migration highways that shaped the landscapes of their age. Across the vast plains and forests of the Jurassic, life moved in rhythms larger than the rise and fall of the sunlight. These rhythms stretched across seasons, guiding herds of dinosaurs on journeys that spanned hundreds of kilometers. The Earth itself still bears the traces of these endless marches. Fossilized trackways, stretching across ancient floodplains and dried riverbeds, tell us that migration was not just an instinct, but a way of survival, shaping the very landscapes through which the giants passed. Herds of sauropods, their long necks swaying like pendulums above the trees, may have traveled in columns that stretched farther than the eye could see. Each step pressed deep into the soil, heavy feet leaving behind impressions that would harden into stone. Some trackways record dozens of animals walking side by side, their prints aligned in steady patterns, suggesting groups that move together, perhaps even in family structures. The young likely walked in the middle, shielded by adults from predators circling the edges. These marches were slow, deliberate, and unstoppable, carving pathways into the land with a patience that only creatures of such size could maintain. The reason for these journeys lay in food and water. A single herd of giants could strip a valley of vegetation in a matter of weeks. To sustain themselves, they had to keep moving, following the seasonal growth of plants, chasing the rains that brought ferns and cycads back to life. The fossil record preserves this rhythm. Layers of sediment show trackways that return year after year along the same routes, like highways written into the earth by repetition. These seasonal migrations carried herds to floodplains during wet months and back to higher ground when waters receded. It was a cycle as steady as the monsoons, linking the survival of dinosaurs to the breathing of the planet itself. Predators followed these movements closely. The great hunters of the Jurassic were not tied to one place, but to the herds that sustained them. Fossilized evidence shows predator tracks alongside those of herbivores, sometimes trailing, sometimes intersecting suddenly, as though the story of a hunt had been pressed into the ground. The hunters moved as shadows across the highways, their lives dependent on the migrations they shadowed. Where the herds went, life followed, and death was never far behind. The emotional weight of these journeys is staggering when imagined in scale. Picture a valley at dawn, mist lifting as an entire herd begins its march. The ground trembles with the weight of dozens of sauropods, their calls rolling low and deep, carrying across the distance. Behind them follow stegosaurs and smaller herbivores, grazing what remains in the giant's wake. Insects rise in clouds as feet disturb the undergrowth. Dust hangs in the air, glinting in shafts of light. To stand at the edge of such a procession would be to feel dwarfed not only by size, but by the sense of inevitability, as though the land itself had set into motion and could not be stopped. Over time, these highways reshaped the environment. Constant trampling compacted soil, turning forest into open pathways. Streams were redirected by the press of thousands of feet. Valleys became corridors where vegetation was cropped short each year, while new growth flourished in the wake of the herd's departure. The land adapted to the migrations as much as the dinosaurs adapted to the land, each influencing the other in a cycle that endured for millions of years. For the smaller creatures of the forest floor, these highways brought both risk and opportunity. The passing herds left behind dung that nourished insects, bones that fed scavengers, and footprints that filled with rainwater to create miniature ponds. Yet they also brought destruction, flattening everything in their path. Life adapted to this rhythm, timing its cycles to the thunder of footsteps, the endless march of giants. To imagine the sight of these highways from above is to see rivers of life flowing across the landscape, shimmering with movement, pulsing with survival. They were not random wanderings, but carefully timed journeys etched into the memory of the earth. And as these migrations wound their way across the plains, every breath of the creatures making the journey was drawn from air that felt different than ours, heavier and stranger, a reminder that the very atmosphere of the Jurassic shaped the way life endured. The air of the Jurassic was not the same air we breathe today. It wrapped the world in a thickness that felt heavy, humid, and alive with heat, yet within it there was less of the very element that sustains us. Oxygen levels were lower than what fills our lungs now, meaning that every breath carried less fuel for life. For creatures of our size, this might have meant fatigue, slower movements, and a constant struggle to draw enough air. But for the giants of this age, it was the atmosphere that shaped their very existence, forcing adaptations that allowed them not only to survive, but to thrive, and in many cases to grow larger than anything before or since. To imagine breathing in the Jurassic is to picture air that lingered with weight, every inhalation filling the chest more slowly, every exhalation leaving behind a sense of labor. For a sauropod with a neck stretching higher than a house, moving air through that enormous body was no small challenge. Their lungs were not like ours. Instead, they carried an intricate system of air sacs, hollow chambers that extended into their bones, lightening their skeletons while allowing oxygen to circulate efficiently. This system worked like a bellows, pulling air through in a continuous flow, ensuring that even in an atmosphere with less oxygen, their massive muscles and hearts received what they needed. The heart itself had to be a marvel of biology. Imagine the effort required to pump blood up a neck several meters long to a brain perched far above the ground. Scientists believe that sauropods may have carried hearts weighing hundreds of kilograms, pumping with immense force, each beat slow but powerful. Their circulatory systems were designed to handle the heaviness of each breath, each drop of blood carrying oxygen slowly but steadily through the enormous distance of their bodies. Predators adapted differently. Allosaurs and their kin had lungs similar to modern birds, with air sacs extending into their bones, allowing for a more efficient exchange of gases. This gave them bursts of energy in a low-oxygen world, fueling sprints and strikes when the opportunity arose, but even they could not afford to waste energy recklessly. The environment itself forced caution, shaping hunting strategies that relied on patience, ambush, and teamwork rather than constant pursuit. Every breath was precious, every movement calculated. Even smaller creatures felt this weight. The tiny mammals that scurried in the undergrowth lived in burrows where oxygen levels were even lower. To survive, their metabolisms may have slowed, their bodies conserving energy in ways that larger animals did not need to. Amphibians, with lungs and skin that absorbed oxygen directly from the moist air, thrived in wetlands and rivers, where water enriched with plant life could offer a steady supply of dissolved gases. Each creature found its own way to adapt, each tied intimately to the breath of the world around them. The lower oxygen also shaped the pace of life itself. Some scientists suggest that it influenced gigantism, the tendency of creatures to grow larger in size. Paradoxically, the thinner oxygen may have encouraged adaptations that made animals more efficient in their breathing and circulation. With air sacs spreading through their skeletons, dinosaurs could grow lighter than their massive frames suggested, balancing size with the ability to move and feed. Their immense bodies carried within them systems refined to function in an atmosphere that would have challenged us to even take a brisk walk. The emotional reality of this world is profound. Imagine standing in a Jurassic valley as herds move slowly across the plains, the ground vibrating beneath their steps. You draw in a deep breath and feel it heavier, less satisfying than the air you know. Around you, giants thrive in this same atmosphere, their lungs pulling with slow precision, their hearts pounding with the weight of survival. Every breath is harder won, every heartbeat slower, yet life not only survives, it flourishes, filling the earth with thunderous footsteps and endless motion. The very air carried its own story, shaping the bodies and behaviors of the creatures that breathed it. And from these slow, powerful breaths, the record of life was etched into the ground, preserved in graveyards of bones, where whole herds and predators alike were swallowed by time, leaving behind cemeteries of stone that whisper of a world long gone. Scattered across the earth are places where time seems to hold its breath, places where the ground itself is filled with the remains of creatures long gone, lying together in layers of stone. These are the fossil graveyards, vast cemeteries that whisper of vanished worlds. To walk among them today is to walk upon echoes of catastrophe, where lives ended not one by one, but in sudden waves of death that left entire herds, predators, and scavengers buried side by side. Each graveyard carries a story, written in bones and sediment, waiting patiently for us to read. Some of these mass death sites speak of drought. Imagine a long dry season in the Jurassic, the rains failing, rivers shrinking into trickles, wetlands fading into cracked earth. Herds of sauropods and stegosaurs, driven by thirst, gather around the last pools of muddy water. Each day, the ground grows softer under their immense weight, trapping the weakest. The air fills with the stench of death as more creatures crowd the shrinking oasis. Predators, drawn by the opportunity, arrive not to hunt but to scavenge, adding their own remains to the growing tragedy. When paleontologists uncover these sites, they find layers of bones pressed together, from giants to tiny scavengers, all bound by the silence of a vanished drought. Other graveyards tell of floods. In an age when storms could unleash torrents of water across valleys, rivers often rose with terrifying speed. Imagine a herd crossing a floodplain when a wall of water, fed by rains and distant mountains, sweeps across the land. The smallest dinosaurs are carried off their feet. Even the giants struggle as the ground gives way, sucking them down into quicksand-like mud. Their bodies are buried rapidly by silt, sealed before scavengers can scatter the remains. Millions of years later, their skeletons lie in neat arrangements, the positions they fell in preserved, as though the flood had frozen them in time. The layers of mud that entombed them also trapped the plants and insects of the moment, creating a complete portrait of a single day of catastrophe. Some bone beds reveal the violence of sudden catastrophes more dramatic still. Volcanic eruptions during the Jurassic hurled ash across landscapes, choking lungs and covering herds in a gray shroud. In these sites, the bones lie close together, delicate remains preserved in fine ash that settled quickly, capturing even the outlines of skin or feathers. Other sites suggest deadly gas releases, where carbon dioxide or methane erupted silently from lakes, suffocating everything nearby in a single night. The next morning, silence reigned, and time began the slow work of burial. These cemeteries of stone do not tell of long decline, but of swift, merciless endings. The emotional weight of such places is heavy. Imagine kneeling in the dust of a fossil bed, brushing away the earth to uncover the curve of a rib, the outline of a skull, and then realizing it is not just one creature but dozens, all pressed together, their lives ended in a single event. Each bone carries the memory of breath, of heartbeat, of survival cut short. Together, they form a chorus of silence, a reminder that even the mighty were at the mercy of earth and sky. And yet, these graveyards are not only about death, they are also about preservation, the chance alignment of conditions that allowed bones to harden into stone rather than vanish into soil. Without catastrophe, we would have fewer windows into the Jurassic world. Without floods, droughts, and sudden endings, the bones of giants would have scattered and decayed, leaving us with shadows instead of detail. The very tragedies that ended lives gave us the cemeteries that now allow us to glimpse them. To stand in such a place is to feel both awe and grief. The land itself speaks, though softly, telling us of rivers that once raged, of skies that once darkened, of herds that once thundered across plains. It is a reminder that extinction is not only a story of endings millions of years ago, but a rhythm that has shaped Earth again and again. From these stone graveyards, where silence preserves the echoes of ancient catastrophes, the story shifts to stranger shapes still, creatures so unusual that they seem almost like experiments of evolution, oddities that carried sails, spines, and features beyond imagination. The Jurassic was not only an age of giants and predators, but also a canvas where evolution seemed to experiment without hesitation, sculpting creatures so unusual that they appear almost like dreams carved into flesh and bone. Many of these little-known dinosaurs and reptiles carried features that defy easy explanation, spines rising like spears, sails stretched like canvases, and bodies shaped in ways that feel both strange and mesmerizing. To look at their remains today is to glimpse nature's wilder imagination, a reminder that the past was not simply filled with the familiar forms we picture, but also with oddities that challenge our sense of what life can be. One such creature was the Amargasaurus, a sauropod far smaller than the towering Brachiosaurus, yet armed with a display that made it unforgettable. Along its neck rose a double row of long spines, jutting upward like the masts of a ship. Some scientists believe these spines supported a sail of skin, stretched taut, and perhaps brightly colored, catching the light like a banner unfurled. Others suggest the spines stood bare, formidable spikes meant to deter predators. Imagine the silhouette of this creature at dawn, the spines cutting sharp lines against the sky, a living fusion of strength and spectacle. Its very shape tells us that in the Jurassic, even plant eaters could wear armor or carry displays that left rivals and hunters alike wary. Another odd form emerged in the Kentrosaurus, a smaller cousin of the Stegosaurus, whose back carried not only plates but also long, narrow spikes jutting from its shoulders and hips. Its body looked like a hybrid of ideas, as though evolution had tested different blueprints in a single animal. The shoulder spikes may have been for display or defense, a visual warning that made predators hesitate before striking. To watch such a creature moving slowly through the forest would have been to see danger written into its outline, every step accompanied by the gleam of bone spines catching the light. The seas, too, carried their own experiments. Reptiles like the Attopodentatus swam with mouths unlike any other wide, shovel-shaped jaws lined with rows of teeth that acted like combs. These strange mouths were not for hunting fish but for scraping algae from underwater rocks, turning the reptile into one of the earliest known herbivores of the seas. To picture it swimming is to imagine a creature that looks almost assembled from mismatched parts, a reminder that adaptation can shape even the strangest features into success. On land, the Concavenator stood out with a hump on its back, a sudden rise of elongated vertebrae near its hips, creating a small but striking sail. Its purpose remains uncertain. Perhaps it was for thermoregulation, storing heat or shedding it when the day grew too hot, or perhaps it was for display, a bold curve rising from its back to signal strength or attract mates. This odd feature makes the dinosaur look almost uneven, its body shaped with an asymmetry that catches the eye. Yet, in its strangeness lies survival, a form refined not for our sense of beauty, but for its own. Some of the most bizarre forms were carried by smaller reptiles, ones whose names are less known. Tiny creatures with elongated fingers may have stretched skin into gliding membranes, drifting from tree to tree in the forests. Others developed skulls adorned with ridges, knobs, and crests, their heads painted with structures whose purpose we can only guess at. Perhaps they were weapons, or perhaps they were ornaments, as vivid and varied as the plumage of birds today. Evolution, it seems, was willing to try anything, shaping experiments into life, some lasting for millions of years, others vanishing quickly, leaving only fragments for us to puzzle over. Emotion lingers in these creatures because they remind us that the past was not uniform. It was filled with forms that startled, confused, and dazzled, even in their own time. Imagine standing in a Jurassic Valley and seeing not only the familiar silhouettes of long-necked sauropods and lumbering stegosaurs, but also creatures with sails rising like flags, spines gleaming like lances, or humps breaking the smooth line of their backs. The world would have felt unpredictable, filled with bodies that looked almost impossible, yet were entirely real. And so, as the giants and hunters moved through forests and plains, alongside them walked these stranger forms, quieter perhaps, but no less important. Evolution experimented wildly in the Jurassic, sculpting creatures beyond imagination, creatures whose strangeness still makes us pause today, creatures that tell us life is never finished in its artistry. From these bizarre experiments, the story drifts into the night skies of the Jurassic, where stars millions of years older than our own constellations cast their light over both the familiar and the strange. When the sunlight dipped below the horizon in the Jurassic world, the land did not fall silent. Instead, another kind of life stirred, softer and stranger, painted against a sky so pristine that its memory now exists only in stone and imagination. The nights of the Jurassic were darker than ours, untouched by human light, the heavens crowded with constellations millions of years older than those we know today. Every star burned clearer, their pale fires scattering across a canvas of black so wide it seemed endless. To look up, then, was to see a sky unspoiled, carrying the light of galaxies, untouched by the haze of industry, a view no human will ever truly see again. Beneath that canopy, the land shifted into another rhythm. The giant sauropods, who had spent the day stripping branches and shaking the ground with their footsteps, now slowed into stillness, resting in valleys or near rivers where the air was cooler. Their bodies cast shadows in the starlight, dark shapes rising like mountains in the grass. Yet the quiet they brought was only an illusion. Around them, smaller lives filled the darkness with sound. Insects were the first voices of the night. Beetles clicked in the undergrowth, their hard shells knocking like pebbles. Crickets, or their ancient cousins, chirped in steady patterns, a chorus rising and falling like the breath of the forest. Dragonflies that had darted across ponds in daylight now rested on reeds, their wings gleaming faintly in the moonlight. Moths fluttered through the trees, drawn to the pale glow of flowers that had not yet evolved, landing instead on cycads and ferns, searching blindly. The hum, the buzz, the constant background of countless tiny wings and legs filled the night air with a texture that was alive, a soundscape both delicate and endless. Then came the calls of the predators, Allosaurs, Ceratosaurs, and smaller hunters that stalked the edges of the forests, raised guttural cries that rolled low and deep, carrying across valleys. Some were territorial, warning rivals to stay away. Others were hunting calls, short and sharp, breaking the hum of insects like sudden cracks in the silence. Imagine lying in the grass of a Jurassic plain, the stars heavy above, and hearing that sound rising from the tree line, a reminder that the night belonged not to the quiet, but to the hunters who thrived in its shadows. Smaller creatures made their own voices heard. Frogs croaked from riverbanks, their throats swelling like drums, each call echoing against water. Lizards rustled softly through fallen leaves, quick bursts of movement that vanished just as quickly. Tiny mammals, still only sparks in evolution's story, squeaked as they darted from burrows to forage under cover of darkness. Their lives were tied to these hours, when giants rested and predators moved carefully, giving the smallest a chance to slip unseen through the night. The emotional weight of such a scene is powerful. The stars above glowed with constellations utterly alien to us, their positions shifted by millions of years of cosmic drift. Patterns existed then that no longer exist now, names never given, myths never written. The Milky Way itself would have stretched brighter and clearer, its spiral arm like a river of silver across the heavens. Every creature beneath it lived without knowing what those stars were, but they were constant companions, marking the rhythm of nights just as much as the calls of predators and the hum of insects. The nights of the Jurassic remind us that the world was not only built on sound and movement, but also on silence and stillness. Between the calls and the rustles, there were long pauses when the air itself seemed to hold its breath, when the stars pressed closer and the earth felt vast and eternal. To be alive then, even for a moment, would have been to feel part of a sky no human will ever see again, a canopy of ancient light shining over a world alive with voices both small and terrifying. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the creatures of the night played out their hidden dramas, deep beneath the earth, another force stirred the restless fire of volcanoes, shaping soils and searing landscapes, reminders that the world itself was as much a predator as any beast that walked its surface. Beneath the footsteps of giants, the earth itself was alive with a restless energy. The Jurassic world was not only forests, seas, and skies, but also fire stirring deep within the planet, waiting for moments to break free. Volcanoes dotted the land, some rising as mountains that smoked quietly for years, others erupting with little warning, spilling molten rock and ash across valleys filled with life. These eruptions were as much a part of the story of the age as the creatures themselves. They were reminders that the earth was both a creator and a destroyer, shaping landscapes, feeding soils, and ending lives with the same breath. When a volcano erupted, the devastation was immediate and terrifying. Walls of fire spilled from its peak, rivers of lava creeping down slopes and devouring everything in their path. Forests that had stood for centuries were reduced to glowing stumps in hours. Herds of dinosaurs, caught unprepared, fled in panic across plains, their shadows flickering in the red glow of molten streams. Ash rained down from the sky, first in flakes like gray snow, then in heavy clouds that turned day to night. The air filled with the choking sting of sulfur, every breath difficult, every step slowed by the weight of falling dust. In some regions, eruptions buried entire valleys, ash blanketed rivers, smothered wetlands, and sealed creatures where they fell. Fossils discovered in such layers preserve not only the bones of dinosaurs, but also the outlines of plants, insects, and even soft tissues. These sudden burials froze moments of tragedy, capturing the exact instant when life met fire. To study them today is to peer into a scene that ended in minutes, yet remains written in stone for millions of years. Yet volcanoes were not only destroyers. In the long span of time, they also created. When the fires cooled and the ash settled, the land transformed. Volcanic soils, rich with minerals, became fertile grounds where plants grew with astonishing speed. Ferns were often the first to return, their spores drifting on the wind, carpeting blackened fields with a soft green. Soon after came cycads, conifers, and ginkgos, their roots sinking into the enriched soil, feeding on the nutrients left behind by the eruption. What had been destruction became a cradle of regrowth, a landscape reborn more lush than before. For the creatures of the Jurassic, this cycle was both a curse and a gift. The immediate devastation took lives and reshaped migrations, forcing herds to abandon regions swallowed by ash. But in the years that followed, the same areas became magnets for survival. Rich vegetation drew sauropods back to graze, followed by stegosaurs and smaller herbivores, and behind them came the predators, their paths tied to the abundance of prey. The giants may have walked away from fire, but they always returned to the fertile fields it left behind. The emotional force of this cycle is powerful. To stand near an active volcano in the Jurassic would have been to feel the Earth's heartbeat itself, pulsing beneath your feet, trembling in the ground, whispering warnings in the smoke that curled upward. Imagine the sky glowing orange at night as lava lit the horizon, the air vibrating with distant rumbles that rolled through valleys like drums. For the creatures living in its shadow, the volcano was both terror and promise. It could erase entire forests in a single eruption, yet in its ashes it sowed the seeds of renewal. Even the oceans felt this fire. Underwater volcanoes bubbled to the surface, creating islands of fresh rock that rose from the waves. Some would crumble back into the sea, but others would persist, forming new coasts that became homes for reefs and breeding grounds for marine reptiles. The boundaries of land and sea shifted constantly, drawn and redrawn by eruptions that shaped coastlines across the planet. The Earth of the Jurassic was not quiet. It was a world where fire slept just beneath the surface, where mountains could roar without warning, and where the ground could split open to pour rivers of molten stone. Yet from this fury came renewal. The giants that walked the land were not only shaped by forests and storms, but also by the restless fire that gave and took with equal power. And as this fire remade the land, so too did it shape the communities that lived upon it, forging bonds of survival, families and herds that moved together through cycles of loss and abundance, finding resilience in a world that never stopped changing. When we picture the Jurassic, it is easy to imagine it as a world ruled only by strength and survival, a place where every moment was predator against prey. Yet the fossils tell a softer story woven through the chaos. They reveal signs of bonds, of herds moving together, of parents protecting their young, and of communities built from instinct and care. Life in the Jurassic was not simply red in tooth and claw. It was also families walking side by side, voices echoing across valleys, and small acts of survival carried out not alone, but together. Evidence of herding appears again and again in the trackways left behind. Long lines of footprints, pressed into once soft mud, show multiple animals moving in the same direction, their steps aligned, their pace steady. These were not random gatherings but organized movements. Sauropods, some stretching longer than 30 meters, appear to have traveled in groups, the young sheltered within the circle of adults. Fossil sites suggest that entire herds crossed floodplains together, grazing in patterns that reshaped landscapes. Such unity was more than protection against predators. It was a way of life, a rhythm that allowed giants to move safely across distances that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Parental care is another thread that emerges from the stone. Fossilized nests of sauropods show carefully arranged eggs laid in clusters, sometimes in shallow pits dug into the soil, other times in sandy banks warmed by the sunlight. Some of these nesting grounds spread across entire hillsides, as though dozens of individuals had gathered at the same time to lay their eggs. The sheer scale suggests that nesting was not a solitary act but a community event, with multiple mothers returning season after season to the same site. Within the fragile shells, embryos grew in warmth and safety, their tiny bones preserved in rare fossils that still whisper of beginnings millions of years old. Smaller dinosaurs, too, appear to have shown care. Fossils of oviraptor, found crouched protectively over nests, suggest that some parents may have guarded their eggs with devotion, wings spread to shield them from predators or rain. In other cases, hatchlings have been discovered near adult remains, implying that the bond extended beyond the nest, with young staying close to parents as they learn to forage and survive. These glimpses of connection remind us that even in an age of predators, tenderness had a place. Group dynamics extended into the lives of predators as well. Evidence from bone beds shows multiple allosaurs preserved together, their remains suggesting that these hunters may have gathered in loose groups, perhaps even working in cooperation to bring down prey larger than anyone could manage alone. Healed injuries on prey species, matched with predator tooth marks, hint at attacks carried out by more than one hunter. While we cannot know for certain how deep their cooperation went, the fossils suggest that even the fiercest carnivores were not always solitary figures, but sometimes part of shifting, dangerous communities of their own. The emotional truth of these discoveries is striking. Imagine a dawn on the Jurassic Plains. A herd of sauropods moves slowly through the mist, their low calls rolling like thunder across the land. Within their shadow, young calves walk unsteadily, nudged forward by the bodies of adults on either side. On a nearby hillside, nests lie warm beneath the sunlight, each one a fragile cradle of life. And in the distance, predators watch, not simply as lone shadows but as a group, their movements in tune, their eyes scanning together. It is not only survival that shapes this world, but connection, cooperation, and care. The bonds of the Jurassic remind us that life has always been more than a struggle. It has also been about communities, about voices echoing to guide herds, about parents standing over fragile shells, about groups moving in rhythm through landscapes filled with danger and abundance alike. From these traces of care and cooperation, the story turns again, this time toward change itself, as climates shifted and seas rose, carrying the world slowly into the age that would follow. The Jurassic world did not end in a single catastrophe. There was no sudden firestorm or instant collapse to close the chapter. Instead, the curtain began to fall softly, with shifts so gradual that the creatures living through them may not have noticed. Yet across millions of years, the Earth was already preparing for its next great act, the Cretaceous. Climate, seas, and life itself changed quietly, weaving a new stage for evolution to play upon. The climate that had once been steady and warm began to stir with new variations. While the world remained free of polar ice, some regions grew wetter, while others turned drier. The once stable greenhouse climate developed subtle contrasts, creating new challenges for the creatures that lived within it. Monsoons that had nourished forests grew heavier in some places, while elsewhere drought stretched longer. These shifts altered migration routes, forcing herds to adjust their patterns and predators to follow in new ways. What seemed small, year by year, became profound across the long measure of time. The seas also began to rise. The slow tearing of the supercontinent Pangaea continued, spreading the continents farther apart, allowing new oceans to swell between them. Where land had once stretched unbroken, shallow seas now crept inland, turning plains into coastlines and valleys into bays. These shallow waters became rich ecosystems of their own, filled with corals, ammonites, and fish that thrived in the warm, sunlit depths. For dinosaurs living on the coasts, the world would have seemed to be shrinking, the sea encroaching steadily, cutting across familiar paths and forcing herds to adapt to narrower ranges. With the shifting seas came new opportunities for life. Marine reptiles explored these expanding waters, adapting to niches once closed to them. Some became faster, others larger, their shapes refined to chase prey in newly formed environments. Sharks diversified, filling roles left empty by older species. On land, plants began subtle transformations as well. While forests were still dominated by conifers, cycads, and ginkgos, the first stirrings of flowering plants began to appear toward the close of the Jurassic. They were rare and delicate at first, but they foreshadowed a revolution that would one day reshape the planet's landscapes. The animals themselves changed with the shifting world. New dinosaur species appeared, their forms different from those that had ruled earlier in the Jurassic. Predators refined their speed and senses, some growing feathers that hinted at a future where wings would dominate the skies. Herbivores experimented with body shapes and defenses, producing new armored species with plates and spikes arranged in unfamiliar patterns. The world was not simply losing its old rulers, it was quietly training new actors, rehearsing for a stage that was about to transform. Emotionally, this slow transition carries a haunting weight. Imagine standing in a Jurassic Valley near the close of the period. The giants are still there, their silhouettes familiar against the horizon. Herds still graze, predators still stalk, and pterosaurs still darken the skies. Yet the land beneath feels unsettled. Rivers follow new courses as seas push inland. The storms seem heavier, the dry seasons longer. In the forests, plants you do not recognize have begun to bloom, their flowers strange and small, their colors subtle sparks against the endless green. The air itself carries a sense of change, though it comes not with a roar but with a whisper, one that only deep time will make clear. The transition from Jurassic to Cretaceous was not a single moment, but a long passage, a gradual shifting of light from one act to the next. The great beasts of the Jurassic did not vanish all at once. Many lingered into the New Age, walking alongside the strange newcomers, sharing the world for a time before passing into memory. It was a stage where old and new overlapped, where the world rehearsed the shape of what was coming, each shift a note in a song of transformation. And as the curtain of the Jurassic lowered softly, the story of life did not end. It turned its gaze forward into the Cretaceous, where familiar giants would mix with new wonders, and where the legacy of the Jurassic would echo in every step, every wing beat, and every breath drawn beneath the shifting sky. The Jurassic may feel impossibly distant, a world buried beneath stone and time, yet traces of it are all around us. Its giants may be gone, their footsteps stilled for millions of years, but its legacy lives on in the skies above, in the creatures that scurry through forests, and even in the way ecosystems still weave together life today. The Jurassic is not just a chapter sealed in fossils. It lingers as a living memory, one we can still touch, hear, and see if we know where to look. The most striking legacy is found in birds. Each sparrow that flits across a street, each pigeon that coos on a windowsill, each hawk that circles above carries within it the story of the dinosaurs. Their wings are not new inventions, but the descendants of feathered arms that first beat against Jurassic air. Their songs are not just notes of the present, but echoes of calls that once filled ancient forests. Archaeopteryx, with its feathers and clawed wings, was the bridge, but the survival of birds into our own time means that when we hear their songs, we are still listening to the Jurassic itself. Reptiles, too, are guardians of this ancient heritage. Crocodiles that bask on riverbanks today are shaped by the same blueprint that allowed their ancestors to thrive beside dinosaurs. Turtles that paddle through lakes and rivers echo designs that appeared long before the close of the Jurassic. Even lizards, with their quick scurrying steps and flickering tongues, carry the resilience of a lineage that weathered storms, predators, and shifting continents. They are survivors not by accident, but because their forms adapted to a world that never stopped changing. Ecosystems themselves carry the mark of the Jurassic. The idea of great herds reshaping landscapes, predators following migrations, and forests regrowing after fire and storm is not unique to that age. It is a rhythm still visible today. Think of wildebeest crossing the African savannas, bison once thundering across North America, or salmon returning to rivers to spawn. These patterns echo the same cycles written into the Jurassic world, where sauropods marched across floodplains and predators shadowed their trails. Life continues to move in great tides, building on lessons written long ago. The fossils we uncover remind us of this resilience. Each bone, each trackway, each nest of eggs frozen in stone is not just a relic of death, but a record of survival. They tell us how creatures adapted to low oxygen, to storms, to volcanic fire, to drought and flood. They show us that gigantism, flight, armor, and social bonds were all experiments in the great workshop of life. Even when entire lineages vanished, others took their place, carrying forward the story of adaptation. Fossils are not only silent witnesses, they are voices speaking across time, telling us that survival belongs not always to the strongest, but to those who can change. The emotional truth of this legacy rests in its nearness. The Jurassic is not gone. It sings in the sparrows that wake us in the morning, in the seabirds that skim waves, in the parrots that flash through rainforests. It watches from the patient eyes of crocodiles and whispers in the rustle of lizards beneath leaves. It is pressed into the stones beneath our feet, where the prints of giants lie preserved, their steps frozen as if the earth itself could not bear to forget them. To walk through a forest today is to tread upon soil made from countless cycles of life and death, layers that include the ashes of ancient ferns, the bones of forgotten reptiles, the footprints of creatures whose shadows no longer pass overhead. The ground hums with memory, the present built upon the past in ways both hidden and profound. And so, as we stand in our own time, we are never truly separate from that ancient world. The Jurassic continues not as a vanished age, but as a living thread, woven into the birdsong of dawn, the hiss of reptiles under the sunlight, and the fossils that remind us of what once was. From this thread, the story of life draws us gently forward toward a closing reflection on wonder, on memory, and on the quiet invitation to keep walking into mysteries yet unseen. The Jurassic was a world of grandeur, a stage where life performed on a scale almost beyond imagination. It was an age when mountains could move with footsteps, when wings wider than houses darkened the skies, and when seas shimmered with both beauty and terror. It lasted more than 50 million years, yet its echoes still hum in the world around us, stitched into the fabric of every bird's wing, every reptile's eye, and every fossil that whispers from stone. To journey through the Jurassic is to walk through a vanished world that feels at once alien and strangely familiar, a place where the earth itself seemed larger, heavier, and more alive. Think of the titans of the land, the sauropods who carried necks like bridges and hearts, powerful enough to move rivers of blood. They were living mountains, moving in herds across valleys, reshaping the land with every step. Around them prowled hunters like Allosaurus, their jaws armed with serrated teeth, their movements guided by patience and power. In the skies, pterosaurs soared with leathery wings, riding warm currents as if the air itself was their ocean. and beneath the waves, reptiles with sleek, muscular bodies cut through the darkness, their presence turning the seas into places of dread and wonder. Yet the Jurassic was not only a gallery of giants, it was also a world alive with subtler stories. The first birds lifted their fragile wings, testing the sky with uncertain flutters that would one day become the confident beats of sparrows and eagles. Tiny mammals stirred in the undergrowth, their small eyes glowing in the night, carrying within them the seeds of futures yet to unfold. Insects hummed, lizards darted, amphibians croaked by moonlit waters. The small lived beside the mighty, and in their survival, they shaped the long story of life just as deeply as the towering dinosaurs. The earth itself played a role as grand as any creature. Volcanoes lit the skies with fire, reshaping landscapes in a heartbeat. Storms swept across floodplains, floods carved new valleys, and droughts drove herds to march across endless kilometers of open ground. The climate breathed with heat and moisture, a greenhouse world where forests flourished without flowers, and the very air carried a heaviness that shaped lungs and hearts. Even the soil remembered fire and ash, nourishing new growth that returned greener, denser, and more abundant after every eruption. To imagine nights in this world is to see stars burning brighter than we will ever witness, constellations long erased by time, shining above herds that shifted restlessly in the dark. To imagine days is to hear forests thunder with footsteps, to feel the crash of waves stirred by marine hunters, and to watch skies flicker with wings casting fleeting shadows across the land. It was a world not only of survival but of connection, where herds marched together, parents guarded their young, and entire communities of creatures moved as one across the land. The Jurassic ended not in sudden fire, but in a slow turning of the Earth's page. Seas rose, climates shifted, and new species emerged, carrying life softly into the Cretaceous. Yet the memory of this age has never left. It lingers in the fossils that lie beneath our feet, in the delicate bones pressed into stone, in the spiral shells of ammonites, in the teeth of predators whose jaws once struck terror. It lingers in every bird's flight, in every reptile's patient gaze, and in the landscapes shaped by rhythms that began millions of years ago. The emotional truth of the Jurassic is this: it has not been forgotten. It lives in the stones, in the skies, and in the very fabric of the world we walk upon. When we listen closely, it still sings in the sparrows that greet the morning, in the hum of forests, alive with small, unseen movements, and in the wonder that rises in us when we imagine creatures larger than buildings walking where we stand today. And so, as we close this journey into the Jurassic, let the awe linger, let the immensity of time and the beauty of life's resilience carry you gently into sleep, or into thought, or simply into wonder. If you've enjoyed this soft exploration, I would love it if you gave this video a gentle like, or perhaps tapped subscribe, so that more curious minds can find this peaceful corner where science and story meet. And if you feel like sharing, tell me in the comments where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it where you are. It is always a joy to see how far across the world these stories reach. Now, take a deep breath, let your shoulders soften, and carry with you the memory of a vanished age that is never truly gone. The Jurassic still speaks, and together we will keep listening as we step quietly into more hidden worlds waiting to be discovered.